They think this is some kind of game. They are blinded by their own superiority complex. These were the words spoken by Russian President Vladimir Putin toward the end of February 2024, when speaking about the then recent comments of Emmanuel Macron, France's president. Macron had claimed that he couldn't rule out the possibility of French troops entering Ukraine at some point during the war, which stirred up controversy all over Europe. Many in NATO initially decried Macron's comments, claiming that there was no possibility that any NATO forces would enter Ukraine. As for Putin, he did what he does best when confronted with a threat: make threats of his own. Putin said that all Western nations, which is essentially Putin's code for NATO, must understand that Russia has weapons capable of hitting targets on their territory. Then he made the big threat. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. This was far from the first nuclear threat that Putin had levied since the beginning of the war, but it was perhaps the one most directly pointed at NATO. Putin's message appeared to be clear: don't ever cross the red line and get directly involved, or the entire world will suffer from the consequences. The threat has backfired. Rather than scaring NATO away, Putin's threats of nuclear annihilation have simply led to the organization realizing that it needs to become more organized. It has to be capable of countering the Russian threat and do so in such a way that Russia will be completely overwhelmed. That's why NATO is now preparing, so it's ready to deploy up to 800,000 troops into Ukraine at a moment's notice. Those preparations are the subject of today's video. We're going to examine exactly what NATO is doing to get ready for sending 800,000 troops into Ukraine, as well as why it's doing it. We'll also answer a vital question: what is likely to happen if NATO actually does go to war with Russia? Let's start with what NATO is doing to prepare. It all started in January 2024 and the organization of what would become the largest series of drills NATO held since the Cold War. Those drills were collectively called Operation Steadfast Defender 2024, and they took place between January 22nd and May 31st. Reuters reported on the details, noting that the operation would include around 90,000 troops from all NATO allied nations, along with 50 ships that ranged from destroyers to massive aircraft carriers. NATO would also practice how to deploy its aerial might, with a collection of 80 fighter jets, drones, and helicopters taking part. Add to this a massive 1,100 combat vehicles, including 533 infantry fighting vehicles and over 130 tanks, and you had an operation unlike any that NATO had held in decades. What was Operation Steadfast Defender's goal? To rehearse how US troops could reinforce the forces of their European allies by deploying as quickly as possible onto the NATO alliance's eastern flank if war were to ever break out with a near-peer adversary. Of course, near-peer can only mean one thing in the context of these drills and their location: Russia. Chris Cavoli, one of NATO's top commanders, outlined the operation in more detail. He told reporters that Operation Steadfast Defender would primarily focus on the execution of regional defense plans NATO has drawn up to deal with a threat on its eastern flank. The drills would occur during a simulated emerging conflict scenario with a near-peer adversary, he claimed, before adding that the operation would demonstrate NATO's ability to rapidly deploy forces from North America and other parts of the alliance to reinforce the defense of Europe. The exercise dwarfed Trident Juncture, which took place in 2018 and involved 50,000 participants, with the only NATO exercise in recent memory that was larger being Reforger. That took place in 1988, toward the end of the Cold War, and involved 125,000 people. Cavoli also noted that the second part of Operation Steadfast Defender would place a focus on the deployment of NATO's Quick Reaction Force to Poland. That location is important. Poland offers routes into the Balkan states near Ukraine's north, as well as the Baltic Sea. It also offers a direct land route into Ukraine from its southeast borders. Other nations involved included Germany, which acts as a central hub for incoming troops, as well as countries like Norway and Romania, which sit on the fringe of the NATO alliance. Think of Operation Steadfast Defender as a prelude of what may come. It was NATO standing directly in front of Russia to say that it was ready to deploy massive numbers of troops rapidly to deal with any threat it could pose in Europe. It was also a response to the threats Putin had been making since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. Granted, the operation was planned to start before Putin made his February threats in response to Macron's comments. However, it's telling that these threats gave NATO no pause for thought during the rest of the operation. It continued through to mid-May regardless. Still, it was only 90,000 troops. That's a number Russia could potentially deal with, especially given that Russia is likely preparing to enforce a second round of mobilization that could add 300,000 soldiers to its forces in Ukraine by the end of 2024. But as we said, Operation Steadfast Defender was just a prelude. NATO's real plans are far grander, and they involve preparing to deploy as many as 800,000 troops to counter the Russian threat. In July 2024, Newsweek reported that the German newspaper Der Spiegel had claimed to get its hands on top-secret military documents from NATO. Within the pages of these documents lay plans to create what Newsweek calls an arterial highway throughout Europe, and involving the United States, that would allow NATO to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops against Russia if the need ever arrived. Germany will serve as the beating heart of this arterial highway. The report claims that Germany's highways, railways, and ports will serve as the launching points for troops onto the Eastern Front. They'll offer not only direct passage into Ukraine, but also enable NATO to transport troops into Poland and to bases in countries like Romania. If you recall from Operation Steadfast Defender, these were the countries that were directly involved in NATO's troop movement exercises during the first half of 2024. Newsweek's report goes on to point out that the arterial highway won't just be the transportation method used by up to 800,000 NATO soldiers. It will also enable the transportation of weapon systems, as well as around 200,000 armored vehicles and tanks. Most worryingly of all for Putin, the plans would enable them to move all of these soldiers and their equipment to the Eastern Front within 3 to 6 months. Two aspects of Germany's logistical infrastructure will make these plans possible: its ports on the North Sea and the A2 highway. Starting with the ports, the Center for Eastern Studies says that Germany maintains 19 seaports that open out into the North Sea. For context, this is a body of water to which Russia doesn't have easy access. To reach the North Sea, Russia would have to sail through the Baltic Sea, risking bombardment from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Sweden, all NATO allies, as it does. Or it would have to head north before doubling back on itself via the Norwegian Sea, which means attempting to bypass Norway, another NATO ally, before entering a sea that's bordered by the UK, Germany, Holland, and Denmark. In short, the North Sea is very difficult for Russia to control. Returning to Germany's seaports, they vary in size to include massive international hubs such as those in Hamburg and Rostock, to regional ports including Wismar and Nordenham. All would play crucial roles in deploying 800,000 troops to the Eastern Front. Not only could the ports welcome troops from the previously mentioned European countries, which would then be deployed via the land-based transportation routes, but they would also be the main point of entry for US soldiers. America would send its troops via the North Atlantic Ocean, arriving in the North Sea and into Germany. Add the ability to send transports into the Baltic Sea, which would carry troops into the Baltic states and Poland, and then onto Germany, and you have a powerful waterborne infrastructure in place. Then comes the A2 highway, also known as the Bundesautobahn 2. Starting in the city of Oberhausen in Germany's west, this highway stretches for about 300 miles to reach the outskirts of Berlin in Germany's east. Crucially, it ends close to the German border, providing a means for sending soldiers into Poland and then possibly onto the Baltic states to reinforce the Eastern Front. But there's a problem with the A2 highway. The route includes 230 bridges, all of which would be obvious targets for Russia in its efforts to prevent NATO from mobilizing. Taking out even a handful of those bridges, while not making the A2 useless, would force the hundreds of thousands of troops using it to divert onto other roads, thus slowing their deployment. NATO's plans have built-in contingencies for just such a situation. Bases are to be constructed along the entire highway to house, resupply, and feed the thousands of troops who will use it to travel. These small bases are going to be so frequent that any transport using the A2 will have the option to stop every 1,000 to 1,640 feet to resupply and rest. For context, the A2 is 300 miles, with each mile being equivalent to 5,280 feet. That would mean about 5 places to resupply every mile, adding up to a staggering 1,500 resupply points built into the main ground-based route that NATO will use to transport its 800,000 troops. Of course, that doesn't necessarily solve the bridge targeting problem. A Bundeswehr Homeland Defense Command spokesperson highlighted that when speaking about the leaked plans a couple of days after they were published. The planning takes into account not just one motorway as an axis of movement through Germany, the spokesperson claimed, but also many motorways and federal highways. In short, the A2 is just one example of several highways Germany is going to reinforce with masses of supply points to enable the transportation of NATO troops. There are other contingencies in place. A month before the NATO documents were leaked, the UK newspaper The Express revealed that NATO was in the process of creating 5 superhighways that stretch throughout Europe. Again, Germany will be the hub. 5 of its North Sea ports will welcome hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the US and other parts of Europe. However, other routes will be made available. One would see American troops land in the Netherlands, after which they'll be transported to Germany via train before using the same mode of transport to reach Poland. There will also be backup ports in Italy, Greece, and Turkey, with discussions in place for the 5th port to be stationed in Norway. 5 more options beyond Germany for landing troops. Those who alight in Italy could likewise use trains to move into Germany before moving on. Greece and Turkey would give NATO's troops the option to approach Russia via the Mediterranean, while offering the possibility of transporting troops by land into Bulgaria and Romania. As for a Norwegian port, it would offer an easy route into the Baltics via Sweden and Finland, as well as a potential passage into the Baltic Sea. Crucially, none of these corridors would be limited by local rules and regulations. All would allow free transport for NATO soldiers, cargo, and equipment without any need for hold-ups at borders. Newsweek provided more details about these land corridors in a June 2024 report. It noted that the plans for these land corridors have been in the making for decades. Italy will link to Slovenia, Croatia, and Hungary, for instance, with plans to also open the Dutch port city of Rotterdam to be used by the NATO alliance. Combined with Germany's focus on superhighways and becoming a hub for troops arriving via the North Sea, a complex logistical web emerges. Half a dozen countries, once Norway is added into the mix, will serve as landing points for troops from the US and the rest of Europe. Each will provide different passageways to the Eastern Front, creating contingency upon contingency. If Russia does happen to take out bridges on the A2 highway, for instance, it'll still face the prospect of troops flooding in through Italy, Holland, Greece, Turkey, and several other countries. The idea is simple: create so many entry points that Russia isn't able to prevent the mass deployment of troops. But that brings us to another question. Why is NATO working so hard to create and reinforce this logistical network? After all, it's not like there isn't already a heavy US presence in Europe. America's military already has 100,000 people stationed throughout Europe who are there to help defend the continental states, provide a quick crisis response, and handle training duties. The US Navy also has its 6th Fleet stationed in Italy, along with the revived 2nd Fleet operating in the North Atlantic. Add to this the bolstering of the American footprint in Europe between February 2022, the month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and today with the addition of another 20,000 troops, and you already have a substantial presence. The problem is twofold. That presence may not be enough, and European countries still need to provide ways to properly mobilize those troops in addition to their own. So the first reason NATO is preparing all of these land corridors and options for transporting troops into and around Europe is logistical. Having troops on the European mainland is not the same thing as having them on the Eastern Front, with every day wasted because of shoddy logistical systems being a day that gives Russia another chance to advance or strike the systems that are in place. And that brings us to the second reason for the creation of this vast network. NATO believes that it needs to prepare for a broader war with Russia. That's according to Jan Kalberg, who's a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He says that every road going east is a potential road for US and European forces, with the plans being put in place partially being designed to put pressure on NATO's continental allies. Their inclusion in these plans forces them to ensure the upkeep of the roads, bridges, ports, and rail routes that NATO intends to use. Think of it as a contingency. NATO hopes to never need those routes, but it has to guarantee that they're in good working order should the time ever come. As for the belief that NATO needs to prepare, that's been evident for some time. Until very recently, the majority of NATO's members were failing to reach the 2% of gross domestic product spending target that the organization recommends. This is highlighted by Forces News, which shows just how complacent many NATO members have become. In 2014, the same year that Russia annexed Crimea, only 3 NATO members hit or exceeded the 2% target. That rose to 5 in 2015 and 16, but dropped back down to 4 in 2017. Between 2017 and 23, the only time the number of nations hitting the target reached double digits was in 2023, when 10 nations managed to spend 2% or more. Bear in mind that NATO now has 32 members, meaning there were several years where only around 10% of its members were hitting the spending recommendations. As for the 2024 numbers, they represent a massive turnaround. 23 of NATO's members have increased their military budgets to the point where they'll reach or exceed the 2% recommendation. That's enormous news because it showcases that NATO's continental membership is making a concerted effort to prepare militaristically for the prospect of war with Russia. The rhetoric coming out of NATO has also changed during the course of the Ukraine war. In the beginning, NATO was extremely wary of suggesting that Russia's invasion was a signal that Putin may have grander designs for the rest of Europe. That's why so many European nations were so slow to cross the red lines, which are actions that could provoke Russia to provide weapons and permission for Ukraine to use those weapons in Russia. The rhetoric has been changing throughout the war. This is perhaps best represented by Rob Bauer, a Dutch admiral who also serves as NATO's military committee chief. He made it clear that NATO was preparing for something big. Speaking in Brussels in January 2024, Bauer said, "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, and that's why we, referring to NATO, are preparing for a conflict with Russia." While not a commitment to sending troops into Ukraine or onto the Eastern Front, Bauer's statements were a clear signal to Putin: "We're getting ready to fight you." That brings us back to the logistical preparations NATO is making. It's one thing to say that you're preparing for war, it's another to demonstrate that fact. One of the reasons Europe is making such in-depth preparations to be able to shuttle 800,000 troops onto the Eastern Front is that it wants to show Russia that it's taking Putin's threats seriously. That's a far cry from the complacency that has gripped Europe for so long. The increases in military spending, the changing rhetoric from NATO's leaders, Operation Steadfast Defender 2024, the largest military training exercise NATO has undertaken since the Cold War, and of course, the leaked plans for transporting troops around Europe. All are signals to Putin that Europe is getting ready for a fight, and that, crucially, it's doing what it needs to do to ensure the US can properly support it in that fight. It's a classic representation of the adage, if you want peace, prepare for war. Speaking of complacency, we come to the third reason why NATO is creating its new logistical network. Its previous rapid response plans simply weren't strong enough to deal with the Russian threat. We can see this from NATO's official documentation relating to its Readiness Action Plan back in July 2016. Just 2 years after the annexation of Crimea, it was clear that NATO wasn't taking the Russian threat as seriously as it should. That plan revealed that the NATO Response Force, or NRF, contained just 40,000 troops. Granted, this was over triple the 13,000 it had in 2014, though even that number shows that NATO was nowhere near ready to quickly react to a Russian attack if it happened. The 2016 Readiness Action Plan showcased a growing NRF, but one that was still far too undersized to handle Russia. It also offered minimal details about the logistics NATO would rely upon to get those troops to appropriate locations. Simply put, it wasn't enough. Consider the fact that Russia's active military numbers 1.32 million people, with a further 2 million in reserve. This is a country that has lost over 580,000 soldiers in Ukraine already, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, and experienced over 70,000 casualties in just 2 months in the Ukraine war between May and June 2024. These numbers indicate that Russia can throw hundreds of thousands of soldiers at wars for which NATO could only respond with 40,000 troops as recently as 2024. Hence the need for these new logistical networks. Now that they're in place, NATO is showing Russia that it won't be dealing with the complacent version of the organization that it may have faced a decade ago. Putin can't make the same threats because NATO has the capability to deploy 800,000 troops within 3 to 6 months, and crucially, every country in the alliance is working together to ensure that those plans are actually workable if the time comes. Again, it all adds up to a clear message for Putin. NATO is ready to fight. Finally, we come to the fourth reason why NATO is investing so heavily in its plans for creating an arterial highway throughout Europe. It knows that Russia is capable of hitting almost any target in continental Europe with its ballistic missiles. These targets include bridges, such as those present on the A2 highway, and ports. As of 2021, Russia has 7 operational missiles capable of traveling at least 5,000 miles. These include the submarine-launched Bulava and Shtil, which can travel for 5,157 and 6,835 miles respectively. The other 5 missiles are all intercontinental ballistic missiles, starting with the UR-100, which is capable of traveling for 6,213 miles, and ending with the R-36, dubbed the Satan by NATO, that has a range of 9,941 miles. This is all without mentioning the many missiles Russia has with multi-thousand-mile ranges that fall outside of this top 7. The distance between Moscow and Paris is just 1,764 miles. The distance to Berlin is even shorter at 999 miles. In other words, Putin was absolutely correct in his statements that Russia has missiles capable of hitting targets in every major European city, at least in terms of those missiles' range. Hence the need for the arterial highway. If NATO wants to effectively transport 800,000 troops, it needs to have backup plans available for whenever Russia decides to make use of these missiles. With the arterial highway, NATO now has backup upon backup. All of which brings us to the final question we'll ask in this video. What happens if NATO goes to war with Russia? Thanks to the arterial highway, NATO will be able to instantly transport hundreds of thousands of troops to every key strategic location it may need to fortify throughout Europe. The pathways it has into Poland open it up to the Balkan states, with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia likely to serve as the front lines in the ground war. Opening up the options of ports in Norway brings that country, along with Sweden and Finland, into the war, giving NATO a good chance to control the Baltic Sea. And with Mediterranean ports being opened up, NATO will have every potential front covered. Even Turkey could play a key role here. Opening up the Turkish Straits to NATO ships would allow NATO to quickly take control over the Black Sea, creating inroads into Crimea as well as another entry point into Ukraine. Speaking of Ukraine, it's worth noting that this is one of the few continental European nations that isn't a NATO member. So not only would Russia have 800,000 NATO soldiers to contend with, but these soldiers will be joined by the 900,000 active military personnel that Ukraine offers. That creates a fighting force of 1.7 million people within months of a war between Russia and NATO starting, around 400,000 more people than Russia has in its active military. Granted, Russia will be able to use conscription and its mobilization efforts to supplement those numbers, but it would still face a combined NATO and Ukraine that has 1.7 million well-trained troops, which will be going up against an army containing increasing numbers of old reservists and conscripts who are poorly trained and rushed to the front lines. In a conventional war, NATO should overrun Russia, at least in Ukraine. It would easily push the Russian fortifications back with the help of Ukraine's forces and create a new front line from which it could attack Russia on its own territory if needed. Add to this that 800,000 NATO troops would just be the starting point. As of March 2024, NATO's members combined to have 3.42 million active military personnel, providing an ample source of manpower to fight against Russia, which is already struggling with training and conscription issues. A conventional war, backed by the arterial highway, should work out in NATO's favor. However, there are a couple of wrinkles to consider. The first of these is that Russia is not without allies of its own. June 2024 saw it sign a cooperative defense pact with North Korea, which contains the condition that one will come to the aid of the other if either faces an attack on its own soil. North Korea has a military of 1.32 million active personnel, though it's likely that these soldiers aren't as well trained as their NATO equivalents. Russia would also face logistical issues in shipping North Koreans over to the war's front, issues that NATO is already handling thanks to its arterial highway plans. Iran and China could also be factors. However, Iran is dealing with issues of its own as the threat of war with Israel looms ever larger. As for China, there's just as much chance that Beijing chooses to sit the war out to focus on its interests in the Indo-Pacific as there is for it to join Russia in a war in Europe. After all, a war between NATO and Russia would weaken both, which is only a good thing for China. The point here is that Russia's allies aren't as organized as the 32 countries that make up NATO. Where NATO can bring 800,000 troops to the fight within 3 to 6 months, it would take Russia much longer to convince its allies to send reinforcements, assuming it could convince them at all. That leaves us with one more thing to consider: unconventional warfare. In other words, even NATO's overwhelming ability to move 800,000 soldiers around Europe quickly doesn't counter the Russian nuclear threat. In desperation, it's possible that Putin could decide to turn to his policy of using nuclear blackmail to control the situation in Europe when faced with the prospect of a war against a rejuvenated and organized NATO. He has the firepower to do it. As the Arms Control Association points out, Russia has 5,580 nuclear weapons, 1,549 of which are strategic warheads that are already targeted at key locations in Europe and the United States. It also has plenty of missiles capable of reaching those locations, as noted before. NATO has counters to this threat as well. Both France and the UK have nuclear arsenals based in Europe, reaching a combined total of 515, many of which are likely targeted at Russia. And of course, the US has 5,244 nukes of its own, with 1,419 of those being tactical warheads. If Putin chose the nuclear option, his predictions on global devastation would likely come true. Whether he's willing to go that far remains to be seen. For now, NATO has plans in place to shuttle 800,000 troops throughout Europe. What do you think of those plans? And do you believe they would help make NATO the clear victor in a conventional war with Russia in the future? At the 2024 Lennart Meri Conference in Tallinn, representatives of the 3 Baltic nations delivered a chilling warning to attendees. We're getting ready to march into Ukraine. All 3, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, are ready to cross the border into Ukraine to help defend it against Russia, regardless of whether they have approval from NATO. In doing so, they would escalate tensions with Russia to near breaking point while creating a massive dilemma for NATO. Should it join the Baltic nations in more directly defending Ukraine, or sit back and wait to see how Russia responds? One thing is clear: the Baltic states see Russia's rising aggression as a major threat to their sovereignty. And that raises some key questions. What would convince the Baltics to send soldiers into Ukraine, and why would they want to do so in the first place? What are the implications for NATO? Plus, exactly how much of an impact would the militaries of these 3 countries have should they enter Ukraine? Let's start by digging deeper into the Baltic announcement. In May 2024, Yahoo News reported on several members of the Baltic states attending the Lennart Meri Conference. There, they issued their warning to representatives from Germany, claiming that they were collectively prepared to march into Ukraine. Those threats, the outlet says, come as a result of all three nations being frustrated with Germany's approach to the use of its weapons in the Ukraine war. Namely, they're not happy that Germany has yet to permit Ukraine to use German-supplied weapons on Russian territory. The Baltic countries see the German response as half-hearted. They think it will do little to deter Russia if President Vladimir Putin and his troops know that they can focus on Ukraine without worrying about strikes on Russian territory. Worse yet, they open the door for Russia to gain significant ground in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region of Kharkiv. If that happens, those gains would represent a major threat to both the Baltic states and Poland. Cautioning restraint, as Germany is doing, could backfire, according to the Baltics. After all, it could lead to Russia finally taking Ukraine, perhaps giving Putin the springboard he needs to launch other invasions in the Baltics. However, it's important to note at this point that none of the Baltics have sent troops into Ukraine yet. They may not even do so. Militani, a Ukrainian news website focused on war in the military, suggests that the Baltics would only consider troop deployment if Russia makes significant frontline gains due to Ukraine not having sufficient Western support. In other words, the Baltics are focusing as much on their own defense as that of Ukraine. Russian success in the latter could spell bad news for the former. This is far from the only indication that the Baltics are getting ready to fight. Another Militani report, this time from May 20, 2024, notes that Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has pointed out that there are troops from several countries in Ukraine already. Those soldiers provide training to Ukraine's forces. Estonia isn't one of those countries yet, with Kallas saying that such an action would require parliamentary approval. But she also says it's an open, public discussion, but I think we shouldn't rule anything out right now. In other words, Estonia sending troops into Ukraine is a possibility. There are also reports of the Baltics shoring up their border defenses to consider. In March 2024, The Conversation published an article discussing the collective decision of the defense ministers of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to create a shared Baltic Common Defense Zone along their borders in January. Though full details of this zone aren't available, it's believed it will contain several physical defensive structures, including bunkers. In fact, Estonia is set to begin construction on 600 of these bunkers in 2025, in addition to working alongside the other Baltic states to develop missile artillery. The country has also doubled the size of its territorial defense force to 20,000. Latvia is doubling the size of its armed forces as well to 61,000 by 2032 and reintroduced mandatory military conscription in 2023. As for Lithuania, The Conversation says it has formed an agreement that allows it to install a permanent brigade of 4,800 soldiers on the border it shares with Russia by 2027. In short, the Baltic states are preparing for war. That's where NATO might come into play. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all NATO members, having joined the organization in March 2004. That membership entitles them to collective defense as part of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. As such, every other NATO country is duty-bound to jump to the defense of any of the Baltic nations if Russia attacks them. Defense is the key word here. If the Baltic countries decide to enter Ukraine on their own volition, would the rest of NATO consider any Russian strikes resulting from that decision to be grounds to fight alongside the Baltics? After all, Russia would argue that the Baltic states provoked the attacks by joining Ukraine on the battlefield, meaning they're the aggressors. Other NATO members may argue that Article 5 doesn't apply in this situation because they won't be defending the Baltic states from Russia. They would be joining it in an attack on the Russian Federation. However, the Baltics represent an important buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. NATO can't allow Russia to take those three states. It would give Russia more control over the Baltic Sea, as well as important strategic positions it might use to intimidate or attack Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other nearby nations. Perhaps NATO members might find themselves in a catch-22 situation. Either they treat a Russian response to the Baltic nations as enough to trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, meaning they also get involved in the Ukraine war, or they sit back and wait, potentially allowing a situation in which Russia gains more territory and becomes an even greater threat to the rest of Europe. That may be the point from the Baltic perspective. Rather than waiting for NATO to act, which all three agree is an invitation to Russia to continue its aggression, they'll take the situation into their own hands. In doing so, they'll force a decision from their NATO allies: fight with us or risk losing us to the Russian Federation. It's a dangerous game, though one all three seem willing to play. The question is simple: why? Why are Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all three of which combined likely can't defeat the Russian military, so willing to risk incurring Putin's wrath by sending their troops into Ukraine? There are several answers to this question, with one already having been discussed. The Baltic countries believe that much of the Western response to the Ukraine crisis has been underwhelming. They argue that nobody seems to be taking the true threat Russia poses, as they see it, seriously, and that Russia may target them next if they succeed in Ukraine. Better to get ahead of the issue by fighting in Ukraine than waiting for Ukraine to fall and reacting to what Russia does next. As for why the three nations believe that they're potential targets for Putin, all three will see historical parallels between themselves and Ukraine. After all, just like Ukraine, they fell under Soviet rule in the aftermath of World War II. For Latvia, that resulted in a complete loss of its independent democracy. Though the territory had spent most of its history being ruled by other countries, the Russian Revolution of 1917 opened the door for Latvia to declare its independence from Russia in 1918. 2 years later, following fighting with both Russia and Germany, the budding Soviet Union recognized Latvia as an independent country. That independence existed under a democratic structure until 1934, when President Kalaris Ulmanis established autocratic rule. Then 1939 came along, and Latvia was essentially merged into the Soviet Union, first being forced to hand over military bases to the Red Army before being fully occupied by Russia in 1940. Though the Soviets played a large part in defeating the Nazis that claimed Latvia between 1941 and 1944, that help came at a huge cost. Latvia officially became part of the Soviet Union after the war, with Russia collectivizing its farms in 1949 and integrating its economy into that of the Soviet Union. The National History Museum of Latvia notes that this early occupation, particularly the years under Joseph Stalin's regime until 1953, was marked by arrests, imprisonments, and deportations. The first year of Soviet occupation alone brought with it the deportation of about 35,000 native Latvians, most part of the country's intelligentsia, with many thousands more following in later years. Exclusion from education, constant exposure to Soviet propaganda, and the Soviet Union trying to instill its concept of planned economy in Latvia were all hallmarks of this time in the country's history. Yet a large contingent of the nation's population yearned for the days before Russia arrived, the 20 or so years in which it was independent. When the Soviet Union was finally on the brink of collapse, Latvia managed to obtain its independence once again. August 21, 1991 saw the country become a separate state. Its people have no intention of allowing today's Russia to return it to Soviet rule. Estonia and Lithuania have similar stories. For Estonia, annexation by the Soviet Union came on August 6, 1940. Thousands tried to resist, with the University of Central Arkansas stating that 1,750 Estonians were killed as a result of the country's resistance. Tragically, a further 7,450 died between August 1940 and September 1944. As seen in Latvia, the Soviet regime began mass deportations even before the end of World War II, which culminated in 10,200 Estonians being sent to Siberian labor camps. A further 35,000 Estonians were conscripted into the Soviet military between July and August 1941. Again, like Latvia, Estonia fell under the Nazi regime during the middle stages of World War II. And again, as seen in Latvia, the Soviet Union successfully fought the Nazis off. But that period of fighting led to 70,000 Estonians fleeing to Sweden and Germany, along with a further 250,000 displacements and 39,000 more deaths. Following the war, Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet rule forced even more devastation on the nation's people. Over 2 days in March 1949, the Soviets deported some 20,700 Estonians to Siberian labor camps, of whom 3,750 died during the journey. More imprisonments came under Stalin, with the years between 1944 and 1951 seeing 30,000 Estonians arrested under political pretenses. Some in the country tried to resist. A collective calling itself the Forest Brothers, which was 15,000 people strong, staged an insurgency in 1944. It was to no avail. Estonia, like Latvia, fell under the Soviet yoke. Estonia was a little faster to throw off the Soviet Union than Latvia. September 1988 saw around 250,000 Estonians take part in pro-independence demonstrations. 2 years later, there was a call for independence by the Estonian Supreme Council. An official declaration followed on August 20, 1991, just 1 day before Latvia gained its own independence. Then there's Lithuania. In many ways, Lithuania's history echoes that of Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania had enjoyed around 20 years of independence from Russian rule before June 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded the country. It forced Lithuania to cut all of its existing political ties. Lithuania was also subject to a secret protocol within the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. It stated that any territorial arrangement of the Baltic region would see the country's northern boundary represent the end of the Soviet influence and the beginning of Nazi territory. As with Latvia and Estonia, the first 2 years of Soviet occupation saw mass deportations. Around 35,000 native Lithuanians were forced out of the country before Germany launched an attack of its own. Again, the story mirrors that of the other Baltic states, several years of Nazi occupation before the Soviet Union regained control. A guerrilla resistance existed in the country between the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Numbering about 40,000, these forces tried to combat the Russification of Lithuania and the repression that came with it. It failed, with Russia's extensive deportations cutting huge swathes out of the resistance until Lithuania was forced to comply with the Soviet systems being imposed on it. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the period between 1947 and 1949 alone saw 220,000 Lithuanians get deported. Many would be sent to labor camps in Siberia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of agriculture, as it had in Latvia, yet underground resistance existed. For instance, Lithuania produced more samizdat, or unsanctioned publications, than any other country in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As with its Baltic neighbors, the desire for independence existed. That desire was realized in 1990 when elections in Lithuania resulted in a legislature that declared the country's independence. The Soviets attempted to topple the newly independent government in January 1991. That attempted coup failed, and as we saw with Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania secured full independence in August 1991. Understanding this history is key to recognizing the Baltic position. All three countries have lived under Russian repression. They fought hard for their independence, and they know that they'll likely be the next targets if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. After all, as Putin made clear during his February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson, the restoration of territory to Russia is one of the main motivations behind his actions in Ukraine. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia based on historical context. He likely sees the Baltics in the same way. All were part of the Soviet Union between the 1940s and 1990s, and all fell under Russian control prior to the country's 1917 revolution. The Baltic nations have also had to watch Russia grow increasingly aggressive over the last 2 decades. While the special military operation in Ukraine is the most obvious example of this aggression, they won't ignore Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, which was over in just days, but marked the first war Europe saw in the 21st century. Like the Baltic states, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. Worse yet, the response to Russia's invasion of the country from the international community was surprisingly muted, an early sign to the Baltic states that their allies weren't taking Putin's aggression seriously. They believe they can't afford to allow the rest of Europe to make the same mistake. And these aren't the only reasons why the Baltic states are considering entering Ukraine. Putin has also made direct threats to all three of them. On May 22, 2024, mere days before the Baltic nations discussed sending troops into Ukraine at the Lennart Meri conference, Politico reported on a Russian draft decree. Though that decree is now deleted, it showed a Russian proposal for the redrawing of its borders within the Baltic Sea. The proposal would essentially see Russia take control of sea territory currently overseen by Finland and Lithuania, with the latter being quick to respond that the draft represented little more than a threat. As Lithuania's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, said to Politico, Russia's actions are seen as deliberate, targeted, escalatory provocations to intimidate neighboring countries and their societies. This is further proof that Russia's aggressive and revisionist policy is a threat to the security of neighboring countries and Europe as a whole. Perhaps that statement could be more accurately categorized as yet another wake-up call delivered to Europe from the Baltic states. Finally, there's Sweden and Finland's decision to join NATO to consider. While certainly good news for NATO as a collective, and the Baltic states in terms of their concerns about Russia, it also brought more threats from Putin. That's because Putin recognizes that Sweden and Finland being part of NATO opens up the Baltic Sea to NATO's forces. Bad news for Russia, given that it sees the Baltic Sea as strategically important to its navy. Its exclave Kaliningrad, for instance, is home to the only Russian port on the Baltic Sea that's available all year round. An increased NATO presence in that region could provoke action from Russia's president. The narrative around Sweden and Finland joining has certainly suggested that many NATO members consider their decision a victory in the Baltic region. Chatham House points out that some have even started to refer to the sea as a NATO lake. Now the collective can run more training operations and is in a better place to defend itself from Russian aggression. However, the decision also opens the door for Russia to push back, potentially leading to it taking a more aggressive stance against the Baltic states. If it does, those states argue, NATO needs to be as ready as they are to fight back. All of which brings us back to the Baltic statements about heading into Ukraine with or without NATO. If they follow through, what can they deliver to Kyiv? All three have already been massive supporters of Ukraine during the war. They each fall into the top 5 in terms of military aid provided as a percentage of gross domestic product or GDP. Latvia has provided 1.5% of its GDP, combined with bilateral donations and those made via the European Union, while Estonia and Lithuania have each provided 1.8%. They also led the way in terms of institutionalizing the aid they provide. Lithuania, for example, has pledged to offer constant support to Ukraine through 2026. The Baltic states see these contributions as being akin to their bolstering their own defenses. All are also engaged in concerted campaigns of de-Russification. Latvia has adopted a new law that will see Russian language teaching phased out of public education by 2025. In July 2023, Lithuania stripped residency permits from 135 Russians living in the country, all of whom it deemed security threats. Estonia has taken similar action, in addition to barring Russians from crossing its border soon after the Ukraine war began. The message is clear from all three. They not only oppose the war, but are actively trying to rid themselves of the Russian influences that remain following the Soviet Union's collapse. As for the direct military assistance each could provide, it's important to note that none of the Baltic states are considered particularly strong, especially when compared to Russia. In Global Firepower's 2024 ratings of 145 military nations, all land in the bottom half of the list. Estonia's position of 87 out of the 145 is the best the Baltics can muster. But that doesn't mean they would not be useful in the fighting. Starting with Latvia, the lowest ranked of the three at 99, the country has 65,750 military personnel, of whom 17,250 are part of its active military. The rest make up its reserves, along with 12,500 that are part of paramilitary groups. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Latvia has no tanks, though it maintains a stock of 1,544 vehicles. It could also bring 59 units of self-propelled artillery into Ukraine, as well as lean on its 6 mine warfare vessels to cause issues in the Baltic Sea. An underwhelming force perhaps, especially when considering who Latvia will be fighting, but that small army will be propped up by Lithuania and Estonia. GFP says that Lithuania could bring more military personnel into Ukraine, as it has 141,150 in total. Granted, only 23,000 of those people are part of its active military. However, it has 104,000 reservists upon whom it could call, along with 14,150 paramilitary troops. Like Latvia, it has no tanks to offer, though it can bring about 1,300 vehicles to the fight. Add to that its self-propelled artillery and towed artillery, 21 and 54 units respectively, and you have a decent amount of ground warfare equipment. Like Latvia, Lithuania's navy is small, consisting of just 11 assets. However, 4 of those are mine warfare ships, creating the potential for it to team up with Latvia to make the Baltic Sea a more dangerous place for Russian ships. Lithuania would also be able to bring a handful of helicopters and fixed transports to the fight. Finally, there's Estonia. The most powerful of the three according to GFP's rankings. Estonia has 96,500 military personnel, of whom 7,700 are active. It brings 6 units of rocket artillery to the conflict, along with 24 self-propelled artillery units. Plus, it could add another 1,409 vehicles to Ukraine's forces. A handful of helicopters and fixed-wing transports would also prove useful, as might Estonia's small navy. It could add 4 more mine warfare ships to the Baltic Sea. These stats show that none of the Baltic nations are powerhouses, but perhaps that isn't the point. The three states will feel a certain kinship with Ukraine, having all previously fallen under Soviet rule themselves. They'll also see Putin making threats against them, and likely consider themselves the next target should Ukraine fall. For that reason, they'd enter the conflict with motivation, not only to help Ukraine but to defend themselves. They could potentially stretch the war's front lines to include their borders, spreading Russia's troops thin in the process, and use their navies to force Russia to expend resources in the Baltic Sea. Then there's the NATO question. Would the Baltic states entering Ukraine serve as a signal to NATO, and particularly the organization's European states, that it has to get involved? Maybe that's what the Baltic states hope for. All three will know that their militaries aren't powerful enough to cause major problems for Russia without support from the West. By entering Ukraine, they may seek to show just how fragile the Baltic buffer between Russia and Europe is, forcing NATO to respond to prevent Russia from taking their territory. If so, it's a risky gambit. Only time will tell if the Baltic nations follow through on their proclamations that they'll enter the Ukraine war if Russia takes more ground. With that, we conclude today's video. Let us know what impact you think Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia could have on the Ukraine war if they joined. Would they manage to force NATO's hand, or would the rest of Europe sit back and wait to see how it all pans out? When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world watched, expecting Kyiv to fall within days under the might of the Russian army. But more than 2 years later, Ukraine has not only survived, but has bested Russia on multiple occasions. How did this happen? The answer lies in military aid from over 50 countries, with one European nation standing out: Germany. Germany, initially hesitant, has become Ukraine's strongest European ally, providing extensive financial aid, military training, advanced weaponry, humanitarian relief, and diplomatic support. Yet even this powerhouse's efforts seemed insufficient, so Germany devised a bold new strategy to help Ukraine indirectly but effectively. What is this secretive plan? How could it create a defensive shield over Ukraine and potentially turn the tide of the war? In this video, we'll unveil Germany's daring strategy to utilize NATO air defense systems, the geopolitical maneuvers behind this plan, and its long-term feasibility. Let's dive into Germany's plan and discover how this unexpected hero is reshaping the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Germany wants to utilize NATO air defense systems to shoot down Russian drones over the west of Ukraine, effectively creating a semblance of a no-fly zone in the area. Given how much Russian drones have decimated Ukrainian forces and civilian areas, this defensive shield should help turn the tides in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. But what would this defensive shield look like exactly? Well, it would cover some 43 miles of the Ukrainian territory, which would now become a safe zone under NATO's protection. The protection in question would come from the alliance's integrated air defense system units stationed in the neighboring countries of Poland and Romania. Of course, the primary reason for the involvement of these two countries is purely geographical. They're located to the west of Ukraine, precisely where the safe zone is to be established. The defense systems themselves would be placed as close to the Ukrainian border as possible. As Agnieszka Brugger, a member of the German Bundestag and the deputy chairwoman of the Alliance 90 in the Greens parliamentary group, puts it, it would be best to deploy air defense systems on the borders of countries that border Ukraine so they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, a fellow member of the Bundestag and the Alliance 90 in the Greens, was the one to specify that the said bordering countries should be Poland and Romania. His exact words were that the possibility of Ukrainian airspace being protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania should not be ruled out in the long run. The long run part is especially important, given that Germany is yet to receive a green flag to enter Ukraine in this way. More on that later. For now, let's discuss how the idea of entering the Ukrainian airspace even came to be. It begins with the April 13, 2024 attack on Israel by Iran, which fired more than 300 missiles and armed drones at Israel. Despite that barrage, Israel managed to deflect much of the attack thanks to a multi-layered air defense system, which consisted of 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles. But that defense system itself isn't the primary reason Germany has contemplated installing an air defense system inside Ukraine. It was the response of Israel's allies that inspired German decision-makers to propose entering Ukrainian airspace. Israel's first layer of defense was the F-35 combat fighters. You're probably well familiar with this jet. After all, we're talking about arguably the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Originally, the F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter jets were produced by Lockheed Martin. They soon caught the attention of Israel, thanks to their advanced stealth and information processing capabilities, as well as an impressive supersonic speed of Mach 1.6. That's not to mention that these jets can carry up to 18,000 pounds of internal and external ordnance in what Lockheed Martin CEO Marilyn A. Hewson referred to as beast mode. So unsurprisingly, Israel became the first country after the US to acquire the F-35 jets, 50 of them to be precise. However, the country has since made significant changes to the model, manufacturing its own wings and electronic warfare system. The subsequent Israeli F-35 variant was named Adir, meaning the mighty one in Hebrew. The jet's might was on full display in April 2024 when these technological marvels were sent to intercept projectiles launched from the territories of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The F-35s reportedly managed to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside Israeli airspace. Now, sending fighter jets to intercept missiles isn't always possible. This decision is made based on speed, altitude, and trajectory of the incoming threat, as well as the capabilities of the available air defense systems. But since the projectiles coming at Israel were sent from relatively far away, there was time for the F-35s to take flight. Interestingly, some of the Iranian projectiles were seemingly targeting the Nevatim airbase, which houses the Israeli F-35 variants in the first place. This just goes to show the strategic value Israel and Iran places on its F-35 fleet and the effectiveness of these advanced fighters in countering threats. But mighty as they are, the F-35s couldn't possibly counter all the projectiles sent Israel's way. That's where Israel's long-standing multi-layered defense system took over. Layer number 1, the upper layer, consists of Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 ballistic missile defense systems. The goal of this layer is to intercept medium to long-range missiles. Layer number 2, the middle layer, is the so-called David's Sling. This innovative defense solution tackles short to medium-range ballistic missiles and larger caliber rockets. It's designed to strike the targets directly, shooting them down from as far as 186 miles away from Israel. And layer number 3, the bottom layer, is the famed Iron Dome. This mobile system defends Israel against short-range surface-to-surface rockets and unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones. Iron Dome is the first missile defense system of its kind, and it's highly capable of handling multiple incoming threats at once, which it successfully proved in April. This system is a primary reason none of the 170 drones sent by Iran hit their targets. But as mentioned, the Israeli air defense capabilities weren't the only reason it was able to thwart the Iranian attack. The US, UK, Jordan, and France also came to Israel's rescue. The US downed over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, according to the US Central Command, or CENTCOM. Even more impressively, some of these projectiles were destroyed before even taking flight from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. The rest were intercepted over southern Syria. The US also provided vital intelligence that armed Israel with the necessary knowledge to take out all the threats coming its way. As for the UK, the country's Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets downed an undisclosed number of Iranian drones. The same goes for Jordan, undoubtedly the most surprising ally to Israel. The country used its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets to fend off the Iranian attack. Though to be fair, the reason Jordan got involved appears to be more self-serving. The Iranian projectiles had to enter Jordanian airspace to get to Israel. So essentially, Jordan was defending its country and citizens, not Israel. According to Brian Kachulis, a senior fellow of US foreign policy at the Middle East Institute, this move sends a clear message that Jordan and Israel have this shared interest in making sure that the airspace in their territory is defended. This leaves us with France, which did take part in Israel's defense, but primarily contributed by patrolling the country's airspace. As a result of this joint action, only a handful of the initially launched projectiles managed to reach Israeli territory, and it was only the ballistic missiles which managed to inflict minor damage near a runway at the Nevatim Air Base and to a road nearby. Though the plan was to paralyze the base and thus damage Israel's air capabilities, Iran failed miserably, as the Nevatim base remained operational after and even throughout the attack. That cooperative system is what inspired German military experts Nico Lange and Lieutenant General Heinrich Brauss to put forward the idea of establishing air defense in bordering countries and in Ukraine. Seeing what can happen when allies come together to defend an impacted airspace, the German parliament members, or MPs, brought Lange and Brauss's notion of Germany and NATO doing the same for Ukraine. Perhaps surprisingly, even the opposing political forces, the Greens, the Free Democratic Party, and the Christian Democratic Union, agreed that this was a good idea. Roderich Kieswetter of the Christian Democratic Union pointed out that this joint action would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. He also mentioned the April attack on Israel as an example, emphasizing that the allies involved in Israel's defense didn't automatically become parties to the conflict. Unfortunately, this argument, as well as the unexpected unity in the Bundestag, wasn't enough to sway the German government to take direct military action in support of Ukraine. This means that Germany isn't allowed to enter the Ukrainian airspace, at least for now. The mere fact that this proposition was even discussed by the Bundestag and attracted so much attention suggests that Germany is reconsidering its role in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict and pushing the boundaries of its commitment to collective defense. If you remember, Bundestag member Anton Hofreiter, who we mentioned earlier, saw this plan being carried out in the long run, so Germany's role in the conflict is likely to continue to evolve. But why hasn't Germany already taken this decisive action to enter the Ukrainian airspace? Well, there are multiple hurdles standing in the way of this historic action. We've already briefly brushed on the first and arguably the most important one. Germany is simply scared that entering Ukraine, even indirectly, would trigger an all-out war with Russia. And let's be honest, a direct conflict with Russia is the last thing Germany would want, especially when both world wars Germany had previously fought against Russia ended disastrously for Germany. And Germany isn't the only one with concerns about escalations. Fear of a greater conflict is also the reason why the US and the UK refused to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the same way they defended the Israeli airspace. The UK's Foreign Secretary David Cameron put it bluntly, saying that deploying NATO forces even indirectly might lead to escalation in terms of a wider European war. Never one to fear an adversary, the US explained its refusal to get involved in a slightly different way. When asked about protecting the Ukrainian airspace with the US defense systems, the White House National Security Council's Strategic Communications Coordinator, John Kirby, pointed out the difference between the Ukrainian and Israeli scenarios. He summed up his difference in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. And to be fair, Kirby's right. Protecting Ukraine would be significantly more challenging than defending Israel from a purely military perspective. Ukraine shares a longer border with Russia, and the conflict zone is vast, with multiple fronts and shifting battle lines. This makes it difficult to establish a clear and secure airspace over Ukraine, especially given Russia's air defense systems and military capabilities. But let's say Germany and other Ukrainian allies move past this fear and commit to protecting Ukrainian airspace at all costs. Is this protection even feasible in the long run? As things currently stand, the answer is a resounding no. Remember, the Iranian attack on Israel was an isolated incident, while protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be an ongoing and complex operation, one that the European allies simply don't have enough air defense systems to sustain. As Markus Faber of Germany's Free Democratic Party pointed out, there are a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So for Germany to even think about defending Ukraine's airspace against Russia, it would first have to secure more defense systems. Only under those circumstances would it be possible to deploy Western air defense systems to protect the sky over Ukraine. And let's face it, Ukraine is no Israel. The country doesn't have the groundbreaking Iron Dome or state-of-the-art F-35s. The country waited for what it seems like forever to even get its hands on the few dozen F-16s it does now have. Throw the damage inflicted by Russia in the months of conflict into the mix, and you'll understand why protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be simply overwhelming. It becomes even more worrisome when you consider that Russian drones seem to keep coming. The country is going all in on so-called kamikaze drones designed to carry explosives, loiter around the target for quite some time, and then crash into it. At first, Russia imported these drones from Iran, opting for the Hesse Shahed 136 models. Since the beginning of the invasion, Russia has reportedly fired over 4,500 of these destructive drones at Ukrainian targets. But it gets worse. Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones at domestic production facilities by the summer of 2025, which doesn't bode well for Ukraine's already weakened air defense. Of course, Ukraine isn't standing idly by. The country's own drones are getting smarter in an effort to dodge Russia's jamming signals. This allows Ukraine to carry out more effective defensive measures while underscoring the country's continual efforts to adapt to the evolving threat posed by Russia. But how long can Ukraine go on its own? Certainly not for too long. The country's drone interception rates are already decreasing drastically, mostly due to the sheer volume of drones being deployed by Russia. Will this be enough to prompt Germany to go through with entering Ukraine? For now it seems plausible, but it's still not close to fruition. Russia has already accused Germany of entering the Ukraine war, so the country might just as well get directly involved. The accusation came in March 2024, in the aftermath of a leaked conversation between top German officials. Believe it or not, these officials discussed war plans on an unsecured phone line, thus breaking the fundamental protocols of secure communication. Unsurprisingly, Russia managed to intercept this call. The call was then recorded and leaked via Russia Today, the country's state-controlled media outlet. During the call, the German officials discussed the possibility of sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine and the potential impact of this move on the war. A potential target of these missiles would be the highly protected Crimean Bridge connecting Russia to Crimea. As a response to the leaked conversation, Russia summoned German Ambassador Alexander Graf Lambsdorff and registered an official protest. The country saw this conversation as proof that Germany was indeed trying to enter the war in Ukraine, questioning whether German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had lost control over his country and parliament. Russia's response also clearly defined their red lines when it comes to Germany's involvement in Ukraine. Even sending the Taurus missiles would mean Germany is entering the war, which would likely prompt Russia to respond accordingly. But what is it about these Taurus missiles that makes them such a threat to Russia? It's simple, really. The Taurus missiles, jointly developed by Germany and Sweden, are considered one of the most advanced weapon systems in use today. This missile is about 16.5 feet long, weighs 1.4 tons, and can be fired from the air via fighter jets. When fired, it travels at speeds of up to 727 miles per hour, almost the speed of sound, and locates targets that are as far as 300 miles away. Plus, this long-range missile flies at low altitude, only about 114 feet, which makes it nearly impossible to detect with radars. Germany uses Taurus missiles to tackle high-value targets, such as enemy command posts and bunkers. Taurus missiles can penetrate several reinforced concrete walls before the actual warhead explodes, which makes bunkers susceptible to their power. Currently, Germany has around 600 Taurus missiles, 150 of which are ready for deployment. But as things stand, Ukraine won't see a single one of these valuable missiles. Even before the leaked call, Scholz was adamant about not sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and he stood firm on this stance time and again. Why? Because of a deep-seated fear of Russia, according to many experts. Though he describes his stance as prudence and not weakness, it's abundantly clear that he believes that supplying Ukraine with this weapon would provoke Putin to such a degree that he would likely retaliate against Germany. So if you're keeping score, that's two things Germany can't do to directly help Ukraine. It can't enter its airspace or send game-changing missiles. And of course, it also can't enter Ukraine in the conventional way, by sending troops. But this isn't surprising. Since the very beginning of the Russian invasion, NATO allies reiterated that no troops would be sent to Ukraine. After all, the country isn't a NATO member, which severely limits the alliance's formal obligations to provide military support. The idea of sending troops to Ukraine became a point of controversy due to a statement made by French President Emmanuel Macron in February 2024. Macron stated, "There is no consensus today to send ground troops officially, but nothing is ruled out." He then added, "We will do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia cannot win this war." Of course, these statements sent shockwaves across Europe. Macron didn't seem too fazed as he reaffirmed this possibility in May 2024. His exact words were, "I'm not ruling anything out, because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out." But unlike Macron, Scholz did rule out this possibility, loud and clear. Scholz said there will be no ground troops, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil who are sent there by European states or NATO states. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg shared the same sentiment, emphasizing that there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine. This raises the total to 3 things Germany can't do for Ukraine. But just because Germany can't enter Ukraine just yet doesn't mean it's leaving the country to fend for itself. If you remember, we mentioned that Germany is Ukraine's single largest donor in Europe. So rather than dwelling on all the things Germany can't do, let's review what the country can do, and has done so far. Number 1. Provide military aid. Germany might not be able or willing to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine, but this in no way lessens the sheer amount of military aid the country has sent so far. If we're talking numbers, Germany has spent approximately $1.7 billion on military assistance to Ukraine in 2022 and $5.3 billion in 2023. So far in 2024, Germany announced plans to ramp up military aid for Ukraine by another $4.1 billion. And this comes after the Bundestag approved a staggering $8.2 billion in military assistance for Kyiv in 2024. But how is this money being spent? Germany's financial commitment to Ukraine is channeled into various crucial areas that significantly enhance Ukraine's defensive capabilities. This includes some $300 million spent on training over 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in Germany. It also covers the advanced weaponry and equipment Germany sent to Ukraine. The money either accounts for the replacement of weapons sent from the stockpiles of the Bundeswehr, Germany's armed forces, or the country's defense industry deliverables. Though Germany's military aid for Ukraine covers virtually all combat areas, assistance in the Air Defense Department probably interests you the most, given the topic of the video. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, Germany has sent a range of sophisticated air defense systems to Ukraine, significantly enhancing the country's ability to protect its skies. This includes 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, and 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems. But there are 2 air defense systems that made the biggest difference: the Iris and Patriot defense systems. So far, Germany has sent 4 Iris-T SLM and 2 Iris-T SLS air defense systems to Ukraine, together with their corresponding missiles. The SLM variant tackles short-range missiles up to 7.5 miles of range and 5 miles of altitude. The SLS variant deals with medium-range missiles, having a maximum range of roughly 25 miles and a maximum altitude of 12.4 miles. So far, these systems have reportedly had a 100% success kill rate in Ukraine, even when faced with the notorious kamikaze drones. As for the Patriot air defense system, Germany has sent 2 of these systems to Ukraine so far, with the corresponding missiles included. Compared to the Iris system, the Patriot air defense offers a broader range of capabilities and enhanced performance. It's designed to counter high-speed, high-altitude threats such as ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as advanced aircraft. From this description alone, it's easy to understand why Ukraine relies on these air defense systems so immensely, especially given how lackluster the country's native systems are. But 2 Patriot systems aren't nearly enough. According to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, the country needs at least 25 to successfully defend its territory. Germany only plans to give 1 more system in the future, but at least it's going all out on missiles, announcing a shipment of 100 Patriot air defense missiles in June 2024. Number 2. The use of German weapons against targets in Russia. This might be the closest Germany will come to directly entering the Russo-Ukrainian conflict so far. In May 2024, the country authorized Ukraine to hit some targets on Russian soil using the weapons Germany is supplying. This authorization came right after the US did the same, which was seen as a groundbreaking policy change. Ukraine was allowed to use these weapons to defend the border region of Kharkiv, 12 miles from Russia, which has been mercilessly attacked by Russian forces throughout May. With 2 of the most direct military involvement measures out of the way, let's quickly list other ways in which Germany has helped Ukraine since 2022. Number 3. It's imposed massive and unprecedented sanctions on Russia, hoping to financially dismantle the country's almighty war machine. Number 4. Germany has sent massive amounts of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, ensuring that medical care, food, and clean water reach the Ukrainian people quickly. Number 5. Germany has provided direct financial aid to Ukraine to allow the country to stabilize its financial systems amidst the ongoing conflict. Number 6. German high-ranking officials have tirelessly pleaded with other allies to send more aid to Ukraine, placing special emphasis on air defense. Though these pleas have seemingly failed to secure the crucial air defense systems, many countries have been making smaller pledges in response to Germany's efforts. According to the German Ministry of Defense, the following countries have promised to send additional aid as a direct response to the country's efforts: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Lithuania, Norway, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, the UK, and the US. Number 7. Germany has vowed to help rebuild Ukraine and is already planning national and international short-term and long-term support. Number 8. Germany has been actively helping refugees from Ukraine, supporting them financially and protecting them socially. And number 9. Germany has supported the efforts of the International Criminal Court to document the war crimes Russia committed in Ukraine, both financially and by directly collecting evidence. This extensive list leaves us with a single question: from where does Germany's tremendous willingness to help Ukraine come? Some experts see this support as a result of Germany's commitment to international law and human rights, as well as basic sympathy for the Ukrainian people. However, the more pragmatic analysts point to a combination of strategic, economic, and political factors that drive Germany's extensive support for Ukraine. Chief among them is the fear that if Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe will follow suit. As German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock put it, ultimately it's about one thing: supporting Ukraine keeps the war away from us. Of course, there are also those who claim that Germany simply can't seem to shake its World War II guilt, which fuels its foreign policy decisions and a remarkable commitment to peace and stability. But what camp are you in? Why do you believe Germany is helping Ukraine so extensively? And do you see the country entering Ukraine directly or indirectly anytime soon? In a world already on edge, Putin's latest gambit, a ramp-up of tactical nuclear weapons drills, sends shivers down the spine. Amidst the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, this chilling announcement serves as a stark warning to the West. But what's behind this sudden escalation? Is it mere posturing, or is there a genuine threat that Russia could unleash nuclear chaos if Western boots, such as those from France, land on Ukrainian soil? Strap in as we dive into the dark heart of this nuclear standoff to uncover the truths that lie behind the surface. Let's unravel the reality behind Russia's nuclear threats. Russia's Ministry of Defense said the exercise will be done to practice the issues of preparation and use of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons have no official definition, but they are generally low-yield arms of shorter range designed to be used against enemy forces on the battlefield rather than against large population centers. They are often forward deployed to bases and may come in the form of not just bombs, but torpedoes, artillery, or even mines. Russia has about 1,558 tactical nuclear weapons, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. While it is modernizing these weapons, NATO's conventional superiority and Western military aid are challenging Russia's position. Despite mounting losses in Ukraine and strategic disadvantages, Moscow's emphasis on its nuclear forces highlights its struggle to maintain parity. The resilience and strategic advancements of Ukraine, supported by Western technology and aid, continue to pose significant challenges to Russia. Russia's tactical nuclear weapons include an estimated 784 in its navy. These come mostly in the form of cruise missiles. There are about 334 in its air force, mostly delivered by bombers, though some fighter aircraft, like the Su-57, are also thought to be capable of using them. The remainder consists of ground-launched missiles. The nuclear exercises will include missile forces in Russia's southern military district, which is headquartered at Rostov-on-Don, and covers the battlefields in eastern and southern Ukraine. The Russian Navy and aerospace forces will participate in the drills. But why would Russia resort to an exercise in the use of these weapons at this particular time? After all, 2024 has mostly been good for the Russian cause in Ukraine, if you count minor territorial gains at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties to be a good thing. These results were good enough for Vladimir Putin, at least, for him to be re-elected as the president of Russia with no difficulty, so the idea that Russian elites dissatisfied with the war would oust him from power is a more distant prospect now. But the summer might be better for Ukraine. Russia has only been as successful as it has this year because of Ukraine's ammunition shortages. In April, Christopher Cavoli, the highest-ranking American general in Europe, mentioned that Russia was firing 5 times as many shells as Ukraine. That's now about to change. In February, the Czech Republic announced that it had identified 800,000 available artillery shells in non-Western countries. The next month, the Czechs found an additional 700,000 shells. Western powers soon began purchasing both sets. In the next couple of months, these shells will arrive in bulk on the Ukrainian battlefields. In April, the United States Congress passed an aid package for the first time in 6 months. Worth $61 billion for Ukraine in total, the bill includes $14 billion worth of weapons and ammunition shipments for the Ukrainian military, including artillery shells and ATACMS missiles. These developments put much further pressure on the Russian military, and on April 21st, the Institute for the Study of War suggested that it would try its best to make the most of the closing window of opportunity. Russian forces will likely intensify ongoing offensive operations and missile and drone strikes in the coming weeks in order to exploit the closing window of Ukrainian materiel constraints. To add to the notion of a closing window of opportunity for Russia, Western leaders have been more adamant in their rhetoric that Putin's invasion not be allowed to succeed, even if it means loosening the constraints on the Ukrainian military. French President Emmanuel Macron was the most prominent such leader. In February, shortly after the fall of Avdiivka, he refused to rule out the idea that Europe should send troops to Ukraine. Macron argued that other taboos had not been broken before. Many people who say never never today were the same people who said never tanks, never planes, never long-range missiles 2 years ago. Let us have the humility to note that we have often been 6 to 12 months late. If you're a regular viewer of us here at the Military Show, then you know that truth is often stranger than fiction. But what do you do when you need a way to keep track of both? Well, we've found a solution, and that's why we're so excited to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, World Anvil. Designed to support creators from all walks of life, whether you're a writer, artist, streamer, game designer, historian, or hobbyist. Their powerful tools help you break down, organize, visualize, and plan out your creative endeavors. With features like interactive maps, chronicles, timelines, and newly enhanced diplomacy webs. Are you an RPG game master? World Anvil supports over 45 systems including D&D 5e, or you can create your own. While players will love World Anvil's extensive character management system, featuring character sheets, journals, inventory management, and spellbooks. But what if you're a writer who wants to create your own universe? With 25 world-building article templates, you can create wiki-style presentations of your world, making it easier than ever to write, organize, and even publish your stories. What we found most impressive, though, are the interactive maps and chronicles feature that allow you to plot events across time and space, truly bringing your narrative to life. Plus, with the new major update to timelines, organizing complex scenes, scenarios, and events has never been simpler. Ready to start forging your own world? Just go to worldanvil.com or use the link in the description, and be sure to use the code MilitaryShow to get 51% off any yearly subscription, giving you access to all the incredible features World Anvil has to offer. Again, that's worldanvil.com, and use the code MilitaryShow to start exploring, creating, and sharing with World Anvil right now. Macron also mentioned in his recent appearances that Russia was the sole aggressor and that Europe would need to do whatever it could to ensure that it did not come out of the war as the victor. More recent comments by other leaders suggested that the West's attitude was shifting toward letting the Ukrainians be more aggressive with the weapons they received. On May 2nd, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron promised nearly $4 billion of annual unilateral aid to Ukraine for as long as the war would last. Importantly, he added that Britain would have no problem with Ukraine using British weapons to attack targets on Russian soil. He said that such a move would be part of Ukraine's right to defend itself, and particularly appropriate given Russia's conduct inside Ukrainian territory. Such long-range weapons would include the British Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missile, which can hit targets at least 155 miles away, though experts believe they might be able to go longer. These weapons are ideal for striking vital military assets deep behind enemy lines, such as command and control centers or supply depots. Ukraine has successfully demonstrated its ability to use these missiles in Crimea as part of a campaign that has forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat from its traditional base at Sevastopol. Its most notable success was the damaging of the Russian submarine Rostov-na-Donu on September 23rd. On April 23rd, the British government pledged additional Storm Shadows as part of the largest aid package it ever passed for Ukraine. Worth $622 million in total, the British package includes 1,600 offensive and defensive missiles, including more Storm Shadows. France pledged its version of the Storm Shadow, called Scalp, shortly afterward. As this rhetoric and news of additional Western military aid was heating up, the Russian government warned that the talk of sending NATO troops to Ukraine amounted to a new round of escalation, and in March, Putin said that it would be a short step to World War III from that perspective, a war he insisted no one wanted. In the first half of 2023, NATO also held its largest exercises since the Cold War, called Steadfast Defender, which practiced the deployment and cooperation of all alliance members across the Atlantic and the length and breadth of the European continent. This operation, too, saw a loud protest from Russia. Russia was making incremental and costly gains when Ukraine was suffering a severe shortage of weapons and ammunition. That situation will no longer be the case in the second half of the year, putting much greater pressure on Putin, who can now expect far higher losses. To answer the question of whether Putin would resort to using nuclear weapons in the presence of French troops, as Macron hinted though, we first need to look at Russia's nuclear doctrine. Russia's official nuclear doctrine permits the use of such weapons in the event of an enemy attack using weapons of mass destruction or conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened. Like the American nuclear football, the briefcase with the Russian nuclear launch controls, called the Cheget, is with the President of the Russian Federation at all times. Russia's defense minister and chief of general staff have their own nuclear briefcases. The Cheget allows the president to communicate with the top military commanders and to the related nuclear forces via the Kazbek command and control network. In 2019, Russia's state Zvezda television channel revealed footage of what it said was the Cheget. In a section called Command, there were two buttons, the white launch button and the red cancel button. Like in the United States, the president has the sole authority to order a nuclear attack. If Putin thought that Russia was coming under a serious enough threat, he would be able to send a launch order to the Russian military, which would quickly reach its nuclear forces. If necessary, Russia has a dead hand or perimeter computer network that could carry out the order on an automated basis. Although Russia's official nuclear doctrine would seem to renounce the idea of a first strike, this is not the case. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union adopted an official no first use policy with regards to nuclear weapons, but this was never truly sincere. For example, the Soviets considered launching a preemptive nuclear attack during NATO's Able Archer 83 exercise. In 1993, the new Russian Federation officially dropped the no first use policy. Meanwhile, since Russia is a dictatorship anyway, official laws and policy count for little. If Putin wills it, there will be a nuclear strike. There is no countermanding authority that would stop him from launching an attack if he was dead set on it. Indeed, some hardliners in Russia want Putin to loosen the country's nuclear doctrine, although he said last year that he saw no reason to make a change. Putin's latest nuclear comments and news of the exercises were met with relative ambivalence in Ukraine and in the West, as have his other overtures to nuclear weapons since the war began. Andriy Yusov, an official with Ukraine's military intelligence, said that nuclear blackmail is a constant practice of Putin's regime in response. Indeed, such practices have been common since the start of the war. Days after the invasion began, Putin ordered his nuclear forces to be put on a state of special alert. This was likely an attempt to discourage the West from supporting Ukraine with weapons and money. That obviously didn't work. In September 2022, as Russian forces were in retreat in the face of Ukraine's counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts, Putin boasted that Russia had unrivaled weapons of mass destruction and that he would use any means available to defend the homeland. "I'm not bluffing," Putin insisted. As if to make the matter clearer, Putin decided to deploy some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus in the summer of 2023. Old Soviet bases built for the purpose of hosting such weapons were reactivated. None of these nuclear-related actions had any effect on the war, though, either on the battlefield or on the diplomatic front. This is why Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling hasn't made much of an impression on anyone. But what if Macron followed up on his rhetoric and French troops got involved? Would this unlikely event make Putin's nuclear threats more than just talk? One must admit that the presence of French troops on Ukraine's soil would be a significant new development in the war. How would Putin react? Would he consider it an existential threat? First, we must note that the presence of French troops alone would not necessarily mean the escalation of the war in Ukraine into World War III. NATO is a defensive alliance only. The North Atlantic Treaty does not obligate its members to assist one another if one of them takes part in an overseas expedition on its own initiative. Suppose Macron and the French government decided to send some troops to reinforce Ukraine. That would be a decision from Paris alone. If the French intended to take such unilateral action, they would not be able to rely on their NATO allies to come to the defense of their forces in Ukraine. The lack of involvement from the rest of NATO may convince Putin that Russia is not under existential threat and need not use nuclear weapons in retaliation. There would also be another consideration. Although Russia has isolated itself from much of the world with its decision to invade Ukraine, it nevertheless depends on a series of relationships with other countries in order to keep its economy afloat, its forces supplied, and its society running. Breaking the nuclear taboo would put these relationships under strain. North Korea likely wouldn't care and continue supplying Russia with artillery shells and other weapons, but the relationship with Pyongyang isn't exactly the most important one. Three relationships in particular have been of pivotal interest for a warring Russia. The first of these is with Turkey. Turkey has sold weapons to Ukraine, particularly its Bayraktar TB2 drone. It's also closed the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the ships of the Russian Navy, in line with the 1936 Montreux Convention, preventing the Russian Black Sea Fleet from being reinforced. Nevertheless, Turkey has not been as severe with Russia as the rest of its NATO allies. Turkey has avoided joining the Western sanctions regime and has become the fourth largest customer for Russian energy exports. In the pre-war years, Turkey attempted to use its relationship with Russia as part of a strategy of geopolitical hedging. Despite Turkey's insistence that Crimea be returned to Ukraine and tensions with Russia in Syria, it attempted to maintain good relations. The best example was its decision to purchase the S-400 air defense system, in a move which brought American sanctions and its exclusion from the F-35 program. For Turkey, though, fostering the relationship with Russia was a way to balance against the West. Since the West was opposed to some of Turkey's moves in the Middle East, particularly against the Kurds, hedging with Russia was a matter of strategic importance for the government in Ankara. There are also certain ideological ties. Under the leadership of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has gone through a period of democratic backsliding and growing authoritarianism. Like Putin, Erdogan has been called a proponent of the civilization state theory, and he has grown Turkey's reach beyond its borders in moves which some experts call attempts at a neo-Ottoman foreign policy. Nevertheless, if Russia were to cross the nuclear threshold, it's hard to see how Turkey would be able to maintain the relationship. In a nuclear scenario, Turkey is particularly endangered, not just because of its geography and its membership in the NATO alliance, but because it hosts American tactical nuclear weapons on its soil. Keeping the nuclear genie in its lamp is in Turkey's best interests, and its failure to mount much greater opposition to Russia in that scenario would force the West's hand in dealing with the so-called odd man out of NATO. Russia using nuclear weapons would force Turkey to choose the West and completely shun Russia for its own economic survival. India is the second critical relationship for the post-invasion Russia. Indian purchases of Russian energy have helped Moscow to weather the storm of Western sanctions, and it's now Russia's third largest customer. India has had a long-running security relationship with Russia as well, with New Delhi keen to purchase weapons such as the S-400 and T-90 tank. However, India has been between something of a rock and a hard place with its relationship with Russia. It's traditionally a non-aligned country, but its primary national security challenge is from a more aggressive China. Such a challenge has drawn India steadily into the American foreign policy orbit, especially through the quadrilateral security dialogue. Deadly border clashes between 2020 and 2022 reinforce the importance of the relationship with the United States. India has so far successfully managed to walk the tightrope between the United States and Russia. Since countering China is also Washington's highest geopolitical priority, it's tolerated India's cozier relationship with Russia. However, all bets would be off in the event that Russia went nuclear in Ukraine. Like Turkey, India would almost certainly be forced to renounce its relationship with Russia for the sake of its trade with the much larger economies of the West and because of its national security interests. And what about China? The relationship with Beijing is by far Moscow's most important. China is now Russia's largest energy customer. It's also a critical source for electronic components and other vital goods that have been targeted by Western sanctions. Russian foreign reserves are now filled with Chinese currency thanks to the exploding trade between the two countries. Unfortunately for Russia, this currency isn't good for much other than trade, and because the economies of the West are now cut off, Moscow must keep trading with China to survive. It can't hedge its bets. China has understood this advantage and used it. Xi Jinping might agree with Putin in his attempts to undermine the US-led international order, but he has so far not been willing to provide military aid for fear of cutting off trade with the West. In a statement following Xi's summit with Putin in 2023, both leaders agreed that all nuclear powers should refrain from deploying such weapons beyond their national borders. Russia's deployment of tactical nukes to Belarus came only months later and may have been an attempt to break the mold that it's now the junior partner in the relationship. Russia's use of these weapons would be a completely different story. If Xi was reluctant to provide military aid for fear of upsetting trade relationships with the West before, Russia's use of nuclear weapons would leave him with little choice but to play a much more forceful hand against Russia. China's economy is already showing signs of trouble. It grew by only 3% in 2022, low by its standards, and has entered a general decline in growth since Xi took power. If Russia broke the nuclear taboo and China refused to join the world in imposing costs for such behavior, it would suffer severely from the severance of relations with the West, which are already under strain. For these reasons, the presence of French troops on Ukrainian soil would not necessarily lead to Putin using nuclear weapons, especially if they are small in number. However, if France launched a full-scale deployment, Russian forces in Ukraine would be in serious trouble. Russia has suffered enormously against a Ukrainian military that it is outnumbered and outgunned. It's reasonable to assume that a better equipped and better trained French force would do far more damage. In the face of Putin potentially being unable to win the war on a conventional basis, the temptation to use tactical nuclear weapons to turn the tide would increase. But France is a nuclear-armed nation, and so Putin would face the awful conundrum of losing the war and losing power, or facing nuclear retaliation and the loss of Russia's most important trading relationships. Hopefully in such a scenario, Russia's elite would decide to pack him off and ship him to an isolated dacha before anything too drastic comes to pass. The prospect of French intervention, especially without its allies, remains unlikely. Nevertheless, Macron's statements and Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling show us how high the stakes are in the game of nations these days. After the end of the Cold War, the people of the world had high hopes that such things were behind them, but history never truly ends. What do you think Putin would do if France or another Western country decided to intervene unilaterally in Ukraine? Could this escalate to crossing the nuclear threshold? And what would be the consequences for Russia even without nuclear retaliation? Russian President Vladimir Putin is in crisis mode. After approximately 2.5 years of fighting, his military still hasn't been able to take Ukraine. In fact, for every territorial gain comes an even fiercer Ukrainian response. Worse yet for Putin, that response is increasingly being backed by the rest of the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars in military aid have been sent to Ukraine, with commitments being made for many billions more. Plus, Putin now has to face up to the fact that his actions have resulted in many NATO members taking steps to rearm themselves so that they're prepared for a possible conflict with Russia. This was not how the annexation of Ukraine was supposed to go. Russia anticipated storming in and taking the country in a matter of weeks, with the West not even having a chance to respond. That didn't happen. Still, at least it's just the West Putin has to worry about, right? It's no surprise that Russia's age-old enemy has come to Ukraine's defense. To Putin, this is just another example of the West trying to exert geopolitical control over the rest of the world by sticking its collective nose into business with which it has nothing to do. Except it's not just the West that opposes Russia. Since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, Japan has positioned itself as not only a partner to Ukraine, but an increasingly viable enemy to Russia. Now the country has dealt another devastating blow to Putin's ambitions and, with further changes to its internal policy, could become an even bigger thorn in the Russian president's side. That brings us to the video. We're going to dig into the latest devastating blow Japan has dealt Russia, along with exploring everything else that Japan is doing to oppose Putin's regime. You'll also learn why all of this is happening in the first place before we explore the key debate that rages on about Japan's approach to the Ukraine conflict. But first, the devastating blow. In February 2024, officials from Japan and Ukraine met to discuss a new investment treaty that could essentially act as a way for Japan to funnel money into Ukraine even as it faces constant bombardment from Russia. During those treaty negotiations, Japan reaffirmed a vow it made at the beginning of the conflict to continue providing support to reconstruct Ukraine. Those talks were extremely productive. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced a bilateral tax treaty in which both countries will codify a set of tax rules that prevent double taxation of companies and individuals. In other words, Japanese investors who want to pour money into Ukraine no longer need to worry about being taxed by both Japan and Ukraine. While this may seem small, it's a sign that Japan is increasingly committed to helping Ukraine by making it easier for its investors to spend the money in the country. Money that Ukraine sorely needs to rebuild and fund its fight against Russia. Japan will support these new tax rules by easing visa controls, again making it easier for Japanese investors to enter and invest in Ukraine, in addition to providing more support to Japanese venture capital companies in Ukraine. Though Kishida didn't provide further details at the time, his Ukrainian counterpart Denis Shmyhal later posted on the social media platform Telegram that Japan would create a two-part program through which it would provide $1.35 billion in support to Japanese investors working in Ukraine. That's $1.35 billion that could turn into many more billions over time, all money Ukraine can use to fund both its war effort and its reconstruction. According to Shmyhal, the new tax treaty also opens doors for major Japanese car makers such as Toyota and Honda to open factories in Ukraine. Again, these production facilities are future-focused, providing work for Ukrainians after the war while showcasing how international companies are far more willing to do business with Ukraine than they are with Russia. A devastating blow for Putin. And it's not the only blow that Japan has landed in recent months. According to Voice of America, Japan had already provided $10 billion in aid to Ukraine as of February 2024. It's important to note that this aid has been both humanitarian and financial, not the type of military aid that many other countries have provided. Following the conference between Ukraine and Japan's prime ministers, it was also revealed that Japan has pledged to provide a further $12 billion in financial assistance, of which $4.7 billion would arrive in Ukraine by the end of February 2024. That places Japan among the top 5 countries in the world in terms of providing financial aid to Ukraine, only falling behind the US, Germany, the UK, and various European institutions. The message being delivered to Putin by Japan is clear. Tokyo supports Ukraine. And if Putin didn't receive that message from this new volley of financial commitments, he'd have certainly gotten it when Fumio Kishida stood in front of the US Congress to deliver a speech on April 11, 2024. On that day, Kishida told Congress the US leadership on the global stage is indispensable, reinforcing Japan's commitment to what Putin would consider the Western global hegemony. Pointedly, Kishida also told those assembled, "As I often say, Ukraine of today may be East Asia of tomorrow," before further lauding the US for the support it provides not just to Ukraine, but to the Indo-Pacific region. He characterized Putin's special military operation as an onslaught from Moscow and asked how long it would be before countries in the Indo-Pacific, Japan included, would face similarly harsh realities were it not for American intervention. Kishida wrapped up the speech with a simple message to Putin: Japan will continue to stand with Ukraine. If Putin believed he had any hope of repairing his relationship with Japan, at least while the Ukraine war is ongoing, those 7 words put an end to that notion. But in truth, the relationship between the two countries has been tense for decades, with Japan's announcement of more financial aid to Ukraine being just the latest in a series of disagreements that have built up to this moment. Disagreements such as those over a small collection of islands that Russia calls the Kurils and Japan dubs the Northern Territories. In the wake of World War II, the Soviet Union seized these islands, which are just 810 miles northeast of the northernmost Japanese island of Hokkaido. That seizure has been disputed ever since, with Reuters pointing out that World War II hostilities between Japan and Russia have still not ended due to their differing stances on these islands. These stances have only grown more resolute due to recent Russian actions. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, Russia appeared to be on the verge of handing the Northern Territories back to Japan during the early 2010s. That possibility actually had an impact on Japan's foreign policy, claims CSIS, as former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe spent much of his tenure working to improve relations between Japan and Russia to create enough goodwill to enable an agreement to be reached. Diplomatic talks, joint tourism projects, and even Japanese investment in local Russian economic development all stemmed from this approach. But Russia essentially took all of that goodwill and tossed it aside. Since 2015, Russia has been steadily increasing its military presence in the Northern Territories, with satellite imagery showing Putin has been building infrastructure that CSIS claims reaches as close as 14 miles away from Hokkaido. These developments include the building of barracks large enough to host a population of 7,000 on Kunashiri, along with the storage of BAL anti-ship missiles or ASMs on the island. That island's southernmost point lies just 10 miles away from Japanese territory. Similar developments include the construction of barracks and installation of Bastion ASMs on Itarofu, just 50 miles outside Japanese territory, along with the expansion of a base and development of a Russian airfield on Paramashiri. That island is just 380 miles from Japan. The BAL and Bastion ASMs have ranges between 185 and 310 miles, leading to Russia essentially sending a message to Japan that it could strike practically any ship near Hokkaido if it wished to do so. Tensions were being raised throughout the 2010s. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which led to Japan showing that it wouldn't be cowed by Putin's aggression. Even with a growing Russian threat looming to its north, Japan had consistently provided financial aid to Ukraine. Furthermore, the country was one of the first to coordinate with the US and other members of the Group of Seven, or G7 nations, a collective of the world's 7 strongest economic powers, to implement punitive sanctions. These initial sanctions included asset freezes, restrictions on SWIFT payment access, and restrictions on the import and export of various controlled items. More sanctions have followed. April 2022 saw Japan revoke Russia's most favored nation status. More asset freezes and export bans were implemented, including bans on luxury goods from Russia. Even in 2024, Japan continues to build on its sanctions. February 2024 saw it join with the G7 to place a price cap on Russian oil, with even more asset freezes and export bans coming in March, April, and June. Japan has also shown its support for Ukraine in other ways. For instance, Fumio Kishida was the president of the G7 in 2023, a position he used to ensure that global attention remained on Russia's actions in Ukraine, according to CSIS. His actions included visiting Kyiv in March 2023, the first time a Japanese leader has visited an active conflict zone since World War II. Uncoincidentally, that visit to Kyiv happened around the same time that Putin held a summit in Moscow with China's President Xi Jinping, with the two events seeming to be the drawing of lines in the sand between the 4 nations. Kishida's wartime visit also marked a break in Japanese tradition, in which it generally focused on diplomacy rather than directly supporting sides in conflicts. Japan was no longer keeping out of the war. Through Kishida, Ukraine has also been given an opportunity to build relationships with Asian nations it may not have otherwise worked alongside. For instance, May 2023 saw Japan's Prime Minister invite Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to a G7 summit, to which Kishida has also invited representatives from India, the African Union, and the Association of Southeast Nations. It was another blow to Putin, as he saw his current rival engaging in diplomatic conversations with countries he would like to curry favor with. So we see the latest blow Japan has dealt to Russia. The promise of billions of dollars in ongoing financial aid is actually just the largest following several diplomatic jabs Japan has delivered. All of this leads us to a question. Why has Japan chosen to now fully support Ukraine in its efforts against Russia? Some of the reasons have already been explained. Japan's relationship with Russia has always featured a certain amount of tension, even during the periods when Japan was trying to extend the diplomatic olive branch. Putin has only added to those tensions by militarizing the northern territories, transforming the islands into very real threats to Japan and its sovereignty, even if we disregard Japan's territorial claims on the islands. Nevertheless, these issues alone wouldn't be enough to explain Japan's slow moving away from attempted diplomacy to full-blown support for Ukraine. There are other factors at play. For instance, Japan is taking a different approach to its foreign policy than it has in many decades. Following World War II, Japan made the purposeful decision to focus on pacifism in its foreign policy. We see that in its dealings with Russia. Until the last 2 years, the nations never came to blows, even with Russia claiming territory that Japan believes rightfully belongs to it. In a piece titled Historical Parameters of Japanese Foreign Policy, Brookings points out that this approach has been extremely lucrative for Japan. The institution of the Bretton Woods system, which required currencies to peg themselves to the US dollar, led to extended periods of economic success. Plus, by taking a more passive role, Brookings claims, Japan has been able to weather various crises, revolutions, and wars seen in the Indo-Pacific and East Asia since World War II, coming out practically undamaged in all cases. However, international circumstances are slowly pushing Japan away from its policies of passiveness and pacifism. The increasing modernization of China since 2000 is one such issue, with Japan likely believing that it's slowly losing its position as one of the chief power brokers in the Indo-Pacific as China's influence grows. That growth in Chinese influence can also explain Japan's approach to Russia. Putin and Xi are clearly allies in many respects. That's evident from the previously mentioned summits. Couple that with Russia's militarization of the northern territories, and Japan now has 2 countries that are subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, threatening its sovereignty. In the face of these issues, Japan has needed to change its national strategy. According to CSIS, this change is actually the result of an evolution that began during the Gulf War in 1991. At that time, Japan heavily relied on the Middle East for its oil imports, though it also contributed $13 billion to support the coalition forces fighting in the Gulf. At the time, Japan's actions were criticized as checkbook diplomacy, with many wondering why the country refused to dedicate any of its own forces to support the coalition soldiers. CSIS notes that the criticism marked a change in how Japan approached the concept of international cooperation. The years that followed saw it forming and expanding partnerships with its allies, in addition to boosting its defense spending. The latter efforts culminated in Japan's cabinet approving a request for the country's largest ever defense package. The package will see Japan invest $55.9 billion into its military in 2024, with the number increasing annually until it reaches a peak of $62.5 billion in 2027. Add Japan's inclusion in a trilateral defense agreement with the US and South Korea into the mix, in addition to strengthening its ties with NATO, India, and Australia, and you have a country that's shifting its foreign policy. Passivity couldn't work in the current global landscape. CSIS notes that these changes in approach appear to be generally supported by the Japanese people. For instance, a survey conducted in March 2022, a month after Russia invaded Ukraine, revealed that 77% of Japan's citizens believe that the international community needed to band together to stop the Russian invasion. If they didn't, the respondents worried the territorial changes Russia enforced could pave the way for future attempts at change, such as a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Again, it comes back to Japan becoming increasingly concerned about power plays by other nations. Russia taking Ukraine would make China more confident in attempting the same in the Indo-Pacific with Taiwan. So it was crucial for Japan that it became part of the collective effort to prevent Putin's special military operation, as doing so means it could justify being part of future collective efforts to stop Chinese expansion. It's a complete turnaround in policy, and a turnaround that hit hard with Putin, who may have believed that he could have maintained cordial relations with Japan even as he invaded Ukraine. That could have been a possibility were it not for another change happening in Japan. The politicians who had spent so long trying to build a stronger relationship with Russia are gradually aging out. That's according to an October 2023 report by the Carnegie Endowment, which noted that even as Japan expressed its support for Ukraine, various pro-Russia lobbies inside the country were making headlines. These older politicians were claiming NATO's responses to Russia were provocative and that Ukraine had misguided policies. However, these lobbyists have been growing quieter since the 2010s, when pro-Russia policies in Japan were at their peak. The assassination of Shinzo Abe was the trigger for this turnaround. The man who had often referred to Putin as Dear Vladimir was responsible for Japan's failure to sanction Russia during the annexation of Crimea in 2014. He also created plans to strengthen economic cooperation between Japan and Russia in 2016. Even when he stepped down from his role as Prime Minister in 2020, the Carnegie Endowment says his influence within Japan's Liberal Democratic Party would likely have led to more pro-Russian policy. Abe's July 2022 assassination meant Putin lost his biggest Japanese ally. He's also had to watch as other allies such as former Prime Minister Yukio Hatsuyama and Yoshiro Mori have grown too old to have any true influence on Japanese policy. They are now retired. Another pro-Putin influence in Japanese politics, Muneo Suzuki, was the first foreign politician Putin received after he became Russia's president. Suzuki even served as an unofficial advisor in Russia's policies under Abe, showcasing just how strong his ties with Russia became. But Suzuki is now working under a cloud of internal suspicion. His imprisonment for corruption in the 2000s hasn't helped, with every effort he's made to visit Russia since February 2022 being blocked by his own party. There's a new generation of politicians coming to the fore in Japan. And with each loss of the old guard, Putin's influence has waned to the point where it's almost impossible for him to maintain a relationship with Japan. Signing a mutual defense pact with North Korea in June 2024 was essentially Putin putting an end to any chances of rebuilding that relationship. To Japan, that pact will be little more than another sign of aggression to go along with Russia's actions in the Northern Territories and its allegiance with China. After all, North Korea represents another major threat to Japan in the Indo-Pacific, as well as a threat to Japan's South Korean allies. As the Council on Foreign Relations highlights, allying with Russia makes North Korea even more dangerous, adding to Fumio Kishida's claims that Russian aggression in Ukraine can't be seen as a Europe-only problem. All of this brings us back to Japan's decision to send even more financial aid to Ukraine. Putin's responses to this powerful blow indicate just how far Russia's relationship with Japan has fallen. In June 2024, Kyodo News reported on the Russian president's comments that the current conditions between the countries aren't conducive to them coming back to the negotiating table to create a peace treaty for the post-World War II era. Japan would likely agree, though not for the same reasons as Putin expresses. According to Putin, the blame firmly rests with Japan and its support of Ukraine. Everything that's been done has been done by Japan, Putin claimed, seemingly ignorant, likely purposefully, of the fact that Japan's decisions are being informed by his actions and his special military operation. These comments came after the suspension of peace talks with Japan in March 2022. Putin went even further, claiming that he will not shy away from visiting the islands that make up the Northern Territories, essentially telling Japan that he's happy to instigate by reinforcing their status as Russian islands. Reading between the lines, we can see that Japan's deepening support for Ukraine dealt a body blow to Putin. It's no coincidence that he ended the peace treaty talks in March, by which point Japan had already been supporting Ukraine for 2 years. The pledge of a further $12 billion in aid seems to be the straw that finally broke his back, with that money sending a clearer message than ever before that Japan is no longer an ally to Russia. It is an enemy. The status as an enemy leads us to the final question we'll ask in this video. Will Japan's pledges of financial aid ever turn into pledges of military aid? Debates have raged over whether Japan should take the final step in solidifying its support of Ukraine. If it does, the blow would be even more devastating to Putin than the deterioration of relationships he's had to watch over the last 2 years and Japan's financial aid packages combined. Still, Japan remains reluctant to provide weapons, to an extent. In truth, Japan has already found a handful of diplomatic workarounds that allow it to indirectly provide weapons to Ukraine without actually providing them itself. For instance, there appear to be no conditions placed on the billions in financial aid it's provided, meaning Ukraine is likely free to use that money to purchase weapons if it so chooses. If nothing else, that aid is helping to keep Ukraine's economy afloat during a period when it would be at deep risk of collapsing. Again, that can help Ukraine to purchase weapons, as well as enable it to keep its manufacturing base running so it can build weapons of its own. More interestingly, Japan has found several workarounds in the weapons department. For instance, Nikkei Asia reported in July 2024 that Japan had agreed to sell $90 million worth of Patriot missiles to the United States, supposedly to help the US replenish its numbers after it's provided hundreds of these missiles to Ukraine. There are no conditions on how the US uses these missile systems once they land in Washington. It's very possible, perhaps even likely, that the Patriot systems Japan is providing to the US will eventually find their way to Ukraine, with the US essentially acting as an intermediary, so Japan doesn't have to deliver the weapons directly. Russia is aware of this. Its foreign ministry claimed that the appearance of any Japanese missiles in Ukraine would lead to consequences for Russia's relations with Japan. However, given the state of those relations, it's likely that Japan isn't too worried about what those consequences might be. It's also worth noting that Japan has provided protective gear to Ukraine as part of its aid packages. Deliveries of non-lethal equipment, including body armor, helmets, and about 100 non-military vehicles, show that Japan is willing to support Ukraine a little more directly. Still, it draws the line at sending weapons. Some argue that Japan needs to change this policy. For instance, an April 2023 article published by the Japan Times pointed out that Japan was the only member of the G7 that had yet to send weapons directly to Ukraine. However, the same report noted that Japan had made changes to its guidelines, allowing it to make the previously mentioned donations of helmets, body armor, and vehicles. At the time, talks were being arranged to discuss the possibility of making further amendments to those guidelines, which would allow Japan to provide Ukraine with lethal weapons. Those talks didn't lead to a change. However, the same report suggests that there is a growing appetite inside Japan for the country to take a more active stance. Nippon Ishin no Kai, a right-wing populist party in Japan, showcases that appetite. In 2023, the party's upper house Secretary General, Naoki Inoue, chose to send 20 pickup trucks, each loaded with canned food and other supplies to Ukraine. He paid for this using a portion of his party members' stipends while sending a message about the delivery. As long as these pickup trucks aren't used to transport machine guns, there should be no problem. It's up to the receiver to use them in that way. As long as we ourselves do not offer the trucks with that intention, we are fine. In other words, it's the same approach Japan potentially might take with the replenishment of Patriot missile systems over a year later. Others argue that Japan may not be delivering weapons directly because it has a deficit at home. One of those people is Atsuko Higashino, who is a professor at the University of Tsukuba studying the Ukraine war. She comes out in favor of Japan delivering Patriot missiles to Ukraine, though she also believes that deliveries are unlikely in the near future because Japan still has a serious deficit when it comes to its defense systems, a deficit that the recent military budget approvals could see it rectify. Perhaps the future will see Japan lending more direct military aid to Ukraine once it believes it's in a position to defend itself against Russia and China in the Indo-Pacific. If nothing else, the $12 billion it pledged in February 2024 will be a serious blow to Putin, both in terms of increased support being lent to Ukraine and the further collapse of Russia's relationship with Japan. Should Japan choose to start sending weapons, that blow will be followed up with a haymaker signaling Japan's intent to truly oppose Russia. and not just in Ukraine, but also in its efforts to expand its influence in the Indo-Pacific, as well as its work to militarize the northern territories. But what do you think? Is Japan edging ever closer to a point where it'll start sending weapons to Ukraine, or is it still too stuck in its pacifism policies to do so? How do you think Russia would react if Japan crossed that line and went merely beyond providing financial aid to Ukraine? Ukraine has permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, meaning the world may be inching ever closer to World War III. At least, that's the impression that David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, gave with recent comments that appeared to give the green light to Ukraine. The Kremlin didn't react well. It believes that using Western weapons to strike targets inside Russia is an escalation of the war it started. And with that escalation, potential repercussions that could see Britain, along with several other NATO-aligned countries, dragged directly into the conflict. The question now is simple: what happens next? Will Ukraine actually start striking Russian targets inside Russia itself? Has it started doing so already, and if so, are Russia's claims of an escalation justified? Before we answer those questions, let's examine the comments that have led us to this situation. On May 3, 2024, David Cameron pledged to provide Ukraine with £3 billion of military aid, approximately $3.84 billion, per year, as long as it takes for that aid to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. That alone would have come as a blow to the Kremlin. Not only would Ukraine receive more help from the UK, which hasn't been shy about supporting the country since the beginning of the war, but the comments represent a long-term commitment. That $3.84 billion will come every year, with no political wrangling required to get it approved. But these weren't the comments that so infuriated the Kremlin. In addition to pledging the money, Cameron also said, "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." A somewhat ambiguous statement. Failing to look at the subtext here could even lead somebody to believe that Cameron is simply restating that Ukraine has the right to defend itself on its own territory, but that's not what he's saying. Prior to making this statement, the UK has generally made it clear that any of the weapons it provides should only be used on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That includes the Storm Shadow missile, which can travel for around 248 miles. Ukraine has used that missile to conduct several strikes in Russian-controlled Crimea, which fits the UK's description of sovereign territory. That much was made clear in February 2024, when the country's government released a statement on the 10th anniversary of Crimea's annexation. "We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or to any Ukrainian territory, and that we will continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes." So Ukraine already had the green light to use British missiles in Crimea, but now it appears to have the green light to use them in Russia itself. Pay special attention to the "just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine" portion of Cameron's comments. They suggest that Britain is fine with Ukraine taking an eye for an eye approach with Russia. Just as Russia strikes in Ukraine, so can Ukraine strike in Russia. Cameron even made that aspect clear later when he said that Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia. Britain isn't the only country that has permitted Ukraine to use the weapons it supplies on Russian territory. Politico reports that most countries providing aid to Ukraine since the war began have done so under the condition that Ukraine doesn't use any of the weapons they supply to attack Russia itself. That's changing. Both Latvia and Finland, countries that likely see themselves as potential targets for Russia if it succeeds in taking Ukraine, have since made similar comments to Cameron's. Ukraine has the right to use any weapons they supply to defend itself, which includes direct strikes inside Russia. Moscow's response was outraged. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for the Kremlin, called Cameron's comments another very dangerous statement, before going on to claim that they represented a direct escalation of the tension around the Ukrainian conflict. Chillingly, he added that such comments could pose a larger threat to European security if they weren't backpedaled. Cameron has taken nothing back. If anything, his comments appear to have emboldened others. On May 24, 2024, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg took part in an interview with The Economist. Stoltenberg, who is coming to the end of his 10-year stint in the role, used the interview to claim that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they've placed on how Ukraine uses the weapons they supply. Some already have, as we've seen with Britain, Latvia, and Finland. However, The Economist believes that Stoltenberg's comments may have been targeted toward the United States. It says his claims had a clear, if unnamed, target, with the US lifting its own restrictions potentially being a key factor in Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. It gets worse for Vladimir Putin. A Sky News report from May 28th looked at the comments made by Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, who believes that the country shouldn't rule out sending its troops into Ukraine. Those comments echo French President Emmanuel Macron's words in February. "We shouldn't rule it out. We should leave Putin guessing as to our intentions." Putin is watching his war with Ukraine slowly shift. In the past, he's been able to launch operations in Ukraine with no direct threat being posed to Russia, even though he understood that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas and those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine. He knew that Russia itself was safe. Ukraine could only use those weapons to defend itself on its own territory. Now he's not so certain. He has several countries, France and Poland included, claiming that direct intervention inside Ukraine is a possibility. And with Britain, France and Latvia all approving the use of their weapons in Russia, as well as NATO's Secretary General placing pressure on the United States, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine starts to target military installations in Russia itself. Putin's response shows just how much these recent developments concern him. Outside of using a Kremlin spokesperson to talk about how Britain's green light represents an unnecessary escalation of tensions within Europe, he has also directly threatened the United Kingdom. On May 6th, Reuters reported that Russia summoned the country's British ambassador, Nigel Casey, to its foreign ministry to lodge a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. For its part, Britain denied that Casey was summoned, instead saying he'd arrived for a diplomatic and pre-arranged meeting in which he would reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine. Russia still decided to use that meeting to make threats. The Foreign Ministry supposedly warned Casey that the use of any British weapons on Russian territory, even by Ukraine, would make Britain a de facto part of the conflict, and with that role comes the possibility that British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, could be targeted. In case there was any doubt left, the Foreign Ministry went on to say the ambassador was called upon to reflect on the inevitable catastrophic consequences of such hostile steps by London and immediately refute the belligerent provocative statements of the head of the Foreign Office in the most decisive and unambiguous way. It's unlikely that Russia got what it wanted out of Casey. But it had delivered its message: allow Ukraine to use your weapons in Russia, and Russia will respond. If the threat wasn't clear enough from the Foreign Ministry's statement, it was made crystal clear when Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills. That exercise began on May 21st, with Reuters reporting that Russian vehicles had started to gather in Russia's southern military district for the first phase of the drill. The district lies adjacent to Ukraine, with Russia apparently running exercises for the launch of tactical nuclear warheads. To make its point even clearer, Moscow has also involved Belarus in the drills, which is a Russian ally and a country that shares a border with Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry even provided details about the drills Moscow ran. It said Russian troops were practicing obtaining what it calls special ammunition, essentially code for nuclear warheads, for Russia's Iskander missiles. They were also practicing equipping potential launch vehicles with those missiles, as well as covertly moving them to designated launch positions, presumably so they could be used to strike Ukraine. Aviation units also took part in the drill, with crews practicing how to fit nuclear warheads to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles before they fly into designated patrol areas. Again, a term that seemed like code for potential launching points. These weren't pre-planned drills. Russia's foreign ministry made that clear when it claimed that they should send a sobering signal to the West, specifically the United Kingdom, as well as what it sees as the puppets that the West controls in Ukraine. It added, "We hope these drills will cool the hotheads in Western capitals, while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." There's the word again, catastrophic. As devastating to Putin as Ukraine getting the okay to use British weapons on Russian soil may be, he's using it as an opportunity to showcase Moscow's power. These drills are a stark reminder to the UK, as well as Ukraine, that Russia has tactical nuclear warheads. They're also a reminder that its troops know how to launch those warheads and that Russia is a far stronger nuclear power than Britain. You could also consider the drills a veiled warning to the United States. Don't bow to NATO pressure, Putin may be telling the US. If you do, we may be forced to turn the Ukraine war into a nuclear conflict that will involve the US if you grant permission to use your weapons on Russian territory. The thing is, you could argue that Ukraine is already using Western weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory. Take Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries as an example. Global Witness points out those attacks started in 2024, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a new front in the war. But it's also here where Ukraine starts to see pushback from its military allies. Though Ukraine considers those refineries to be legitimate military targets, not least because they're believed to supply Russia's military with fuel, the United States has urged Ukraine to halt the attacks. Not because the US is worried about the attacks angering Russia. Rather, the US doesn't want Russian oil refineries going offline to affect global oil prices. Global Witness claims that President Joe Biden is so set on keeping US oil prices stable during the November 2024 election campaign that he wants Ukraine to hold off on these attacks until after that campaign ends. America's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined this thought process in April 2024, claiming that any Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries would have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. His recommendation was that Ukraine focus attacks on tactical and operational targets, with Ukraine likely believing that those refineries fall into both categories, seeing as they're thought to be supplying Russian troops with fuel. Those attacks have also been effective. Ukraine struck 2 facilities during the first few months of 2024, Lukoil's Volgograd and NORWAY factories. The latter is especially important. It provides about 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements, with Ukraine's drone strikes dropping its output by half. Attacks on the Volgograd factory resulted in fires breaking out, allowing Ukraine to claim a small victory against the largest petroleum products creating factory in Russia's southern border region. Worse yet for the US argument, court documents obtained by Global Witness show that both factories have signed contracts to supply the Russian military. Volgograd has a contract with Russia's Ministry of Defense dating back to 2018 to supply Moscow's military with oil products. The NORWAY factory has a similar contract, in addition to one signed in 2020 that sees it providing jet fuel to the Federal Security Service. These are far from the only Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries within Russia. It's launched 12 in 2024 alone, flying in the face of America's politicized argument about avoiding such attacks because of their impact on oil prices. Still, the US response showcases how some Western nations have approached the concept of Ukraine attacking Russia on its own soil. Other attacks against Russia using Western weaponry are a little more complicated. For instance, does it count as an attack on Russian soil if Ukraine is attacking targets on the Russian side of the front line it shares with its enemy? Putin may think so. He regards all of Ukraine as Russian territory. Plus, his current desire for a ceasefire is on the condition that Russia essentially claims all of the territory it's captured from Ukraine thus far during the war. Following that logic, Ukraine's May 2024 attack on a Russian base in Luhansk could be considered a strike using Western weapons in Russian territory. The Sun reports that aerial images show Ukraine unleashing MGM-140 ATACMS missiles on Russian troops in a captured region of Luhansk. These missiles are devastating. Capable of reaching a top speed of 2,300 miles per hour, they have a range of around 186 miles and can carry a 500-pound warhead. But most notably, the missile essentially releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing Ukraine to carpet a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. Ukraine used that feature to its advantage in the Luhansk strike. Aerial footage analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War seems to show that the strikes targeted a Russian training ground, killing 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger in Russian-controlled territory, which Ukraine attacked with 6 of these missiles. There are also Ukraine's attacks on Sevastopol to consider. One of the most recent, a missile strike that struck 2 Russian landing ships and damaged infrastructure at the port in March 2024, demonstrates the level of attack Ukraine is willing to levy at Sevastopol. And again, we may see a territorial wrinkle at play here. Sevastopol is located in Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. To Putin, that means it's Russian territory, and any attack using Western weapons could constitute an attack on Russia itself. But to Ukraine, Sevastopol and the entire Crimea belong to Kyiv, with any attacks launched there simply being attempts to retake territory that it believes rightfully belongs to it. The point here is that it's easy to argue that Ukraine is already striking within Russian territory. That's certainly what it's doing with the oil refineries, though it's not confirmed if it's used Western weapons to make those strikes. It absolutely used American missiles in its attacks in Luhansk, if that strike was conducted on territory that Russia had taken during the war. The same goes for the attacks in Sevastopol. Russia claims ownership of the Crimea region, so Ukraine's strikes against Russia's navy there and in the Black Sea could be considered attacks in Russia. Yet Russia has only now started to warn of catastrophic consequences. Is that a response to the UK and other countries giving their tacit approval for Ukraine to attack Russia more directly? Or are the threats another case of Russian bluster that Putin is unlikely to follow through with? That question remains to be answered in the coming months. What can't be argued is that Russia's outrage at what it deems an escalation of the Ukraine war smacks of hypocrisy. Obviously, Russia started the war, meaning it's directly responsible for the escalation of tensions both with Ukraine and Europe at large. But that's not where the hypocrisy ends. Russia has also been more than willing to use weapons supplied by other countries on Ukrainian territory. Take its receipt of hundreds of Iranian-made drones in mid-2023 as an example. A Reuters report from June of that year says the US believes Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Iran by purchasing several hundred one-way attack drones to use in Ukraine. White House spokesperson John Kirby released a statement claiming that Russia has been using Iranian UAVs to strike Kyiv and terrorize the Ukrainian population. He concluded by pointing out that Russia and Iran's military partnership is deepening. The interesting twist here is that Iran acknowledges that it sent drones to Russia. However, it claims that any drones sent arrived in Moscow before the Ukraine war began. Russia also says that it hasn't used any Iranian drones during the conflict, and yet the US says both are lying. It claims Iranian drones have been flowing into Russia since at least August 2022, and the two countries are cooperating so deeply that Russia is building a special plant in its Alabuga Special Economic Zone to build more of the drones. This is all being done despite Western sanctions that are supposed to prevent Iran from supplying Russia. Russia using Iranian drones throws David Cameron's comments into a new light. Given Britain's close military ties with the United States, as well as the fact that these claims are publicly available, he likely knows that Iran is supplying Russia with weapons. He also knows those weapons are being used in Ukraine. That leads to the obvious argument: what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, if Russia is attacking Ukraine with weapons it has sourced from international partners, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be able to do the same. And Iran isn't the only country that's providing Russia with weapons. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia and North Korea appear to have worked out a trade agreement. In return for food, North Korea has sent artillery shells, a staggering 3 million of them since September 2023. The report quotes South Korea's defense minister, Shin Won-sik, who says his country's intelligence teams have tracked the transfer of around 6,700 containers believed to collectively carry either millions of 152mm artillery shells or around 500,000 122mm rounds. Talking to the Yonhap news outlet, he says it could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent. In return, Russia has not only been sending food to North Korea, but has also provided it with raw materials it can use when building other weapons. But just as it did with the reports of buying Iranian drones, Russia denies that it's receiving artillery shells from North Korea. Ukraine disputes that. A May 2024 BBC report suggests that Ukraine's military believes that not only is North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells, but it's also delivering missiles. And those missiles have been fired in the dozens, injuring more than 70 people and killing at least 24. Russian hypocrisy rears its head again, and the list goes on. In April 2023, Reuters reported on Ukrainian claims that the country's military is increasingly finding Chinese components in weapons Russia is using in the country. Speaking in a video call, Vladislav Vlasiuk, who is an advisor for Ukraine's chief of staff, said, "The trend is now that there are less Western-made components but more, not hard to guess which country, made components. Of course, China." Such components were found in all and aerial drones, apparently used to replace the Swiss-made navigation systems those drones use, as well as in the fire control systems used in Russian tanks. The situation with China is a little different from that with Iran and North Korea. China has consistently denied providing weapons to Russia, a claim that appears to be backed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Speaking to the BBC in April 2024, he said, "What's not happening is the provision of actual arms by China to Russia for use in Ukraine. Instead, China has been much more subtle," Blinken says, by providing critical components Russia can use to build up its war machine. He added that around 90% of the microelectronics Russia imports and likely uses in the war come from China, as do 70% of the machine tools used in its factories, just as Ukraine claimed in 2023. The threat of sanctions placed against China is designed to slow down this trade. But the point, as is the case with Iran and North Korea, remains: Russia is getting help from overseas powers to attack Ukraine. In essence, Russia already appears to be doing precisely what it's telling Ukraine it can't do: using weapons supplied by other countries to attack another country's territory. For Ukraine, this simply means that using its Western-made weapons to strike Russia would be leveling the playing field, all of which brings us to a final question. Now that Ukraine essentially has permission to use British weapons in Russia, will it actually do so? The odds are high that it will. After all, Zelensky has renewed his calls for Ukraine's Western allies to allow the use of their weapons in Russia, most recently during a joint press conference he held with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on May 27th. We need to intensify our joint work with our partners to achieve more. Security and tangible coercion of Russia to peace by all means, he said before adding, even those partners who are afraid to give this or that advice should understand that air defense is defense, not attack. In other words, Ukraine wants to use the F-16s and missiles it's receiving from its Western partners to retaliate against the 3,000 Russian aerial bombs flying into Ukraine from Russian territory. Jens Stoltenberg also renewed his calls for Ukraine's NATO allies to allow the use of their weapons on Russian territory. He reinforced what Zelensky said, pointing out that Russian forces are attacking from their own territory behind the front line. Much of that front line, he says, essentially runs along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If you cannot attack Russian forces on the other side of the front line because they are on the other side of the border, then of course, you really reduce the ability of the Ukrainian forces to defend themselves. That comment may offer some insight into the nature of the strikes Ukraine wants to use on Russia. It's not looking to fire missiles at Moscow. Instead, Ukraine simply wants the opportunity to attack Russian positions supporting troops on the front line, even if those positions are within Russian territory. The UK has granted permission for it to do so. Will the United States follow? Let us know what you think, and tell us what impact Ukraine having permission to launch attacks within Russian territory, at least from a handful of its partners, will have on the war. Ukraine is about to receive a revolutionary weapon system that could redefine drone warfare: the Australian-developed Slinger. You've seen the devastating impact of drones in countless news reports and social media videos, wreaking havoc on buildings, vehicles, soldiers, and infrastructure. The Slinger system promises to turn the tide in the battle against swarms of low-tech lethal drones. But what makes the system so special? How does it work? And why is it so desperately needed on the Ukrainian front lines? Stay with us as we uncover the cutting-edge technology behind the Slinger, its unparalleled capabilities, and the strategic advantage it offers Ukraine in this high-stakes conflict. But to understand how the Slinger can turn the tide in Ukraine, let's first delve into its impressive technical specifications and capabilities. Developed by Australian defense company Electro-Optic Systems, the Slinger counter-drone system offers an elegantly simple yet highly effective solution to a complex problem. Weighing just over 700 pounds, this self-contained unit is a formidable drone killer. Its primary weapon, a 30mm M230LF Bushmaster chain gun, is complemented by a Belgian-made FN Mag 58 7.62 caliber machine gun. With a 150-round ammunition drum for the chain gun and customizable belted ammunition for the machine gun, the Slinger is ready for action. If fired simultaneously, the chain gun can shoot up to 200 rounds a minute, and the FN Mag 58 can shoot around 650 to 1,000 rounds per minute. That's quite a bit of lead going downrange toward a cheap quadcopter, but that's not all the Slinger can do. Beyond its robust armament, the Slinger boasts cutting-edge detection technology that ensures no drone goes unnoticed. Equipped with advanced detection tools, the Slinger can pinpoint potential drone threats with precision. Its four-dimensional sensor unit continuously emits lasers to measure distances accurately, working in tandem with its primary radar to find, fix, track, and destroy enemy drones. At the heart of the Slinger is the American-made EchoGuard electronically scanned array radar. This revolutionary radar system, typically found in much larger, standalone units, has been miniaturized for compact use. The EchoGuard excels in finding, classifying, and tracking targets of virtually any size under almost any weather. Utilizing unique onboard software capabilities that assist the EchoGuard in differentiating even the smallest and fastest moving of targets, little can escape its gaze. But how does the radar work? As a phased array radar, it sends energy pulses in one direction at a time. These pulses coincide with the maximum area of coverage the radar can see and happen so fast it can give data throughout its whole field of view as close as possible to real-time. For the EchoGuard, it operates in the K-band frequency range of 24.05 and 24.65 GHz. This incredibly high frequency range is great for producing high-fidelity data at short ranges, just what the Slinger needs to do. In addition to having this great data while tracking enemy drones, the operator can set the radar to a 10 Hz search while tracking function even while the Slinger is engaging a target. This is a very valuable capability, since it allows the operator not to get sucked into the current problem and able to look ahead for the next threat constantly. Another great feature of this radar is its field of view. With the ability to scan up to 80 degrees high in the air with a 120-degree cross-section, the EchoGuard radar can provide more than enough coverage for the slinger's own field of view, which is up to 70 degrees straight up and 10 degrees down. But how does the gun stay on target when shooting from a moving platform? Thanks to a gimbal system, the slinger can stay on target no matter the shooter's speed or drone speed to within 1 milliradian. A milliradian is 1,000th of a radian, the angle that intercepts an arc equal to the circle's radius. In plain language, this means that the margin of error for the slinger is so small, it's almost not even measurable. But how far can the slinger really see? EOS testing data reveals that the slinger can detect targets over 12,000 meters away with its daylight camera and more than 13,700 meters with its thermal imaging camera. While this information is sufficient for radar registration, high-quality firing solutions are achieved within 5,600 meters for daylight and 5,100 meters for thermal imaging. For higher quality data that can be used to actually shoot something down, a potential drone would need to fly within 5,600 meters of the daylight camera and 5,100 meters of the thermal imager. Once inside this range, the slinger can begin engaging the target since the operator has enough information to know the drone's bearing, range, and speed. If the drone closes another 500 meters, the operator can even tell the exact make, model, and type of drone. However, drones are only one of the targets the slinger can engage. Because of the multi-threat environment in which the slinger system will operate, drones are not the only adversaries the operator might need to contend with. From operational testing of the system, the slinger can accurately detect and engage vehicles at distances of over 3.5 kilometers, enemy soldiers at 2.2 kilometers, and some of the most common, smallest quadcopters at distances of just over a kilometer. Rounding out the slinger system's main parts are a few other sensors and pieces of equipment that help it to operate. One of these is a wind sensor mounted on the top right of the unit that continually feeds wind data into the slinger's algorithm. Controlling the slinger is a 50-pound control unit situated inside the vehicle. This control unit is almost like a video game, where a user can accurately find, fix, and engage targets with the push of a button. Now that we've gone over a good bit of the technical details of the system, the question still remains of how the slinger is so effective at shooting down small drones. The answer to that question is not what you think. Before Electro-Optic Systems became a defense company, it was a trailblazer in Australia's space industry, pioneering the best way to track objects in near-Earth orbit up to 36,000 kilometers. But how are they able to do this, and why track objects in space? According to recent data, there are more than 29,000 pieces of space debris larger than 10 centimeters, 670,000 more than a centimeter, and a staggering 170 million pieces of space junk larger than a millimeter. And all of this space junk is not just standing still. All the debris is flying around in near-Earth orbit at speeds of around 18,000 miles per hour, about 7 times that of a bullet. When combined with the fact that around 6,000 satellites are orbiting the Earth at any given time, keeping track of this enormous amount of space debris becomes a big issue. Even the smallest piece of junk hitting one of these satellites could be catastrophic. EOS came into the field to help solve this problem. Founded about 40 years ago, the company has become Australia's and one of the world's leading experts in tracking small, fast-moving objects around the Earth. While the company does a lot of research to explore deep space, the primary focus has been crafting cutting-edge lasers and optics that can measure these very small but extremely fast-moving objects within 1 millimeter of accuracy. Because of the decades of experience in doing this line of work, it's no wonder that Slinger was a natural transition for the company to go from space exploration to defense products. Essentially, the technology on Slinger has been in development for decades in the space industry, and the company is now miniaturizing this technology to become a drone's worst nightmare. But of course, the company needs more than just powerful lasers and cool optics to track this fast space debris. It also needs extremely powerful software programs. While the exact capabilities of Electro-Optic Systems' computer algorithms are kept under wraps as a company secret, they are without a doubt powerful. After all, with their lasers tracking tens of millions and potentially more than 100 million objects at any given time of the day, the amount of data that the company is processing is, for lack of a better word, astronomical. To then be able to take this massive amount of raw data, sort it, process it, and then have a usable product in real time within a millimeter of accuracy takes some serious computing power. For Slinger, this software is at the heart of its capabilities. With the ability to intake a huge amount of data from its EchoGuard radar, Slinger then needs to make sense of this information on very small, fast-moving targets in real time for the operator to actually engage them. But how is Slinger adapted from a cool science project to military use? According to press releases from the company, the beauty of the Slinger is that it can be modified to practically anything with wheels. while the official contract Ukraine signed for 160 units has 110 being fitted to M113 armored personnel carriers and 50 going to Bushmaster 4x4 trucks, the Slinger can be fitted to almost any type of vehicle. When EOS showed off Slinger's capabilities at the firing range with live drones, operators fired the unit from Denali pickup trucks. With the ability to turn everything from a simple pickup truck to an armored vehicle to a tank into a mobile drone point defense system, Slinger's utility is really only limited by the operator's imagination. So why is the Slinger really needed in Ukraine? Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the type of fighting has been ever-changing. Due to the absolutely massive casualties the Russians suffered in both terms of soldiers and material, they began looking for ways to preserve their combat power. As for Ukraine, since they've remained the underdog in this fight from the beginning, across all metrics like number of personnel, equipment, and economy size, they too have sought to expand their combat power in a realistic way. In the end, both sides ended up choosing drones to meet their respective needs. But how bad has drone warfare gotten? According to reports from the battlefield, the use of drones has become absolutely critical to how both sides fight this war. They perform a wide variety of functions on both sides. The first and most obvious of these is reconnaissance. Both Russia and Ukraine have bought or developed their own reconnaissance drones. This is because of the depth of Ukraine's air defenses and the strength of Russia's air force. Neither side can get an advantage in the skies. Because of this, both sides rely heavily on reconnaissance drones, since if they get shot down, it's much better price to pay than a multi-million-dollar aircraft and pilot. While reconnaissance drones like Ukraine's UKR jet or Russia's Orlan do a lot of the long-range reconnaissance that is then fed back to higher headquarters, both sides also use larger attack drones. Russia has famously buddied up with Iran to procure thousands of so-called kamikaze Shahid drones, which are meant as one-time use drones that fly at fast speeds and pack a huge punch. To date, Russia has employed more than 4,000 such drones in its illegal conquest of Ukraine. Ukraine has also developed or procured a wide variety of armed drones. Most famously, it's used the Turkish-made Bayraktar drone and the domestically produced UKR jet UJ-22 biplane. But while these attack drones and loitering munitions have played a huge part in the fighting, their use is underscored by an even bigger threat: first-person view drones. Known for short as FPV drones, these small drones are the true menace on the battlefields of Ukraine. They serve various functions. The first of these roles is to serve as local reconnaissance drones. With a range of 5 to 20 kilometers, these small drones are perfect for local company-sized units to have their own intelligence-gathering tool at all hours of the day. In addition to this role, both Ukrainian and Russian artillery units use FPV drones to help spot their fires. While traditionally a forward observer would be embedded with forward units to report what he saw, now a forward observer can get a top-down view in real time and correct fires without playing a game of telephone on the radio. But despite these advantages, the true terror in FPV drones comes in their bomb-dropping capabilities. Both sides employ huge drone manufacturing capabilities dedicated to making small FPV drones or using money to buy civilian quadcopters on the open market. Dotted across Ukraine are hundreds of ad hoc factories set up in abandoned homes, hospitals, and bunkers where Ukrainian volunteers use a variety of methods to not only cobble together FPV drones from open-source parts, but also modify munitions like anti-tank grenades, regular hand grenades, RPG warheads, and mortar shells so they're able to be dropped from these small drones. For Russia's part, they too have hundreds if not thousands of factories both inside occupied Ukraine and inside Russia producing FPV drones on a similar scale. To put some of the numbers into perspective, the Ukrainian government has set a target of 1 million FPV drones to be domestically produced in the country in 2024. This number does not include the huge numbers of FPV drones Ukraine buys on the open market or that are donated by allied countries every day. Both sides of the conflict use FPV drones for a variety of purposes. They use them to target and take out tanks, artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and worst of all, harass and kill unsuspecting individual soldiers anytime, anywhere. Due to the complete proliferation of FPV drones, coming up with ways to take them out has been a priority for Ukraine. But this has been easier said than done. While Ukraine has been provided with some of the West's most capable anti-air systems, they are not necessarily the best choice for taking out drones. For example, the US Patriot and NASAMS systems, along with European weapons like the Iris-T, are all incredibly powerful, accurate, and versatile anti-air defenses. The only problem is they're costly to operate. With a unit cost running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per missile, every time Ukraine fires the weapon, there could be millions of dollars spent per engagement. When firing against Shahed drones with a unit cost in the tens of thousands of dollars, or worse, against an FPV drone with a price in the thousands or even hundreds of dollars, using these highly capable air defense systems is a sunken cost fallacy that Ukraine is on the wrong side of. To counteract wasting precious ammunition on drones meant to exhaust Ukraine's missile supplies and stop the flow of expensive Western aid into the war zone, Ukraine's Western backers have provided a variety of other anti-air systems that the country has put to good use. For example, Germany's legacy Gepard and newer Skynex air defense systems have been donated and proven useful on the battlefield. Utilizing high-capacity autocannons to shoot down short-range, fast-moving targets, these vehicles have downed significant numbers of drones. However, at only around 50 total units operational, these are just a drop in the bucket for what's needed. Ukraine's Western backers have also provided a variety of other air defense systems explicitly geared for drone defense. For example, Lithuania has donated thousands of Skywiper electronic drone mitigation systems. These small portable units are great for point defense of local units that can keep them in a vehicle or trench due to weighing just 14 pounds. The Skywiper works by jamming the radio frequency signals the operator sends to control the drone. But while these systems are great for protecting smaller areas within 3 miles, visible drones outside this range are not susceptible to their effects. Even worse, due to the increased number of GPS jammers on the battlefield, Russia has been hardening its own weapons to become even more jam-resistant, lessening the usefulness of such tools. Another counter-drone system that Ukraine has utilized is the Terrahawk Paladin counter-drone system. Adapted from MSI's Navy variant for land use, the Terrahawk is very similar to Germany's Skynex. Utilizing a powerful autocannon, it's designed to perform point defense in an area of up to 3 kilometers, using its own radar suite. However, unlike Skynex, the Terrahawk is a static weapon, meaning it cannot move on its own and is very vulnerable to enemy counterfire. Ukraine has also not received very many of this system either. The US has also donated several drone defense weapons, including the new Vampire by L3 Harris. Of all the donated drone defense weapons, the Vampire is the most similar to the Slinger. It is its own self-contained unit fully equipped with radar and a control unit that can be mounted onto most pickup trucks. But unlike the Slinger, the Vampire has a 4-rocket pod that can fire 70mm guided rockets or similar munitions. However, despite being very similar, price and capacity are the main drawbacks. At $27,500 per rocket, the Vampire is still on the wrong side of the math equation when shooting down drones worth $500 each. Additionally, with just 4 rockets, a Vampire system could quickly run out of ammunition in a real fight where multiple drones are coming from different angles of attack. Lastly, reloading this weapon while under fire is no easy task, and when out of ammunition, the operator would likely have to egress the area to reload and get back in the fight. As one can see, though Ukraine has received a lot of Western aid, no single system can yet meet the cost-effectiveness and versatility needed when shooting down swarms of FPV drones. So what are the advantages of the Slinger over some of these systems? Arguably, one of the Slinger's best advantages is the cost. Firing 30mm and 7.62mm rounds, the Slinger can engage a huge number of drones for about a couple of $100 to $1,000 per engagement. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of dollars of some of the advanced systems, the Slinger finally gets Ukraine on the right side of the cost equation. Another pro is that the Slinger is very adaptable to whatever platform the Ukrainians need it to go on. Currently, larger air defense systems like the Patriot come with several modules, including the firing unit, radar, command post, and other containers. These containerized systems cannot move quickly on the battlefield. For other legacy systems like Gepard and Skynex, these systems can cost millions of dollars, plus have expensive maintenance to keep the vehicles operational. Additionally, getting a replacement in the field is tough if the vehicle takes any substantial battle damage. On the other hand, Slinger is much more versatile, in that it can be mounted on a pickup truck, tank, or armored personnel carrier, or in a static position. With the ability to quickly displace and be replaced due to its low cost of around $1 million, the Slinger beats out the other mobile platforms. Because the Slinger system is so small, its radar cross-section and energy are much lower than those of other air defense systems. Countries like Russia have developed a wide range of emission-seeking munitions that look for radar energy from an air defense site and home in on it. However, because the energy output from this system only goes a few kilometers and is very small, when operating, Slinger is practically invisible to Russian aircraft unless they are right over the top, which would be a whole other problem in and of itself. But despite these pros, there are a few disadvantages to the system that could eventually give the Russians a way to defeat it. One way is its ability to integrate into Ukraine's overall air defense network. Due to the limited range of its radar, the firing unit would have to be able to share data with assets that have a longer range in order to be forewarned for incoming attacks. Not having this capability to share data can leave operators vulnerable and surprised by massed Russian attacks. This ties directly into the Slinger's next con. In Ukraine, it's been increasingly common for Russia to employ ever-increasing numbers of drones in multi-axis attacks against Ukrainian positions. Though the live-fire demonstrations in Australia were impressive, it should be noted that these were all single-drone engagements. Though Slinger could very well encounter single FPV drones since they're so common, it's increasingly more common to see multiple drones at one time. How Slinger will fare against these multi-threat engagements may only be known when Ukraine uses it on the battlefield. But despite these cons, Slinger will undoubtedly be a game-changer on the battlefield, filling a hole in Ukraine's air defense network. But what do you think? Do you think the Slinger will change the dynamics of drone warfare on the battlefield? When Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, his plan was clear: capture Kyiv in the first few days, before Ukraine or the world had a chance to react. But as history shows, Putin miscalculated. Kyiv didn't fall, Ukraine stood strong, and the world rallied. Among the nations that rose to Ukraine's defense, one unexpected hero emerged: Norway. A country known for its neutrality suddenly thrust into a high-stakes confrontation with one of the most dangerous regimes in modern history. Despite its proximity to Russia and the shadow of potential retaliation, Norway took bold steps that stunned the world. From sending advanced anti-tank weapons that crippled Russian forces to delivering life-saving air defense systems, Norway's support wasn't just generous, it was brave. Its actions were not without risks, as Putin's gaze turned towards this small Scandinavian nation, now a formidable obstacle to his ambitions. How did Norway, a nation more accustomed to peace than war, evolve into a decisive force that changed the dynamics of the battlefield, and what will this mean for the future of the conflict? Join us as we uncover how Norway, against all odds, became one of Putin's biggest problems and a true ally to Ukraine in its darkest hour. Unsurprisingly, our story starts on the first day of the invasion, when the world watched in stunned silence as Putin's forces surged into Ukraine. Norway, however, quickly broke this silence, issuing a press release on the very same day. Norway condemns Russia's military attack on Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. This attack is a serious violation of international law and will have dramatic consequences for the people of Ukraine, Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store's statement said. Store also immediately met with Ukrainian ambassador to Norway to discuss ways to help the Ukrainian people, instantly donating some $23 million in humanitarian aid, primarily to the United Nations Refugee Agency, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, and the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. The rest of the press release made two things abundantly clear. Norway was ready for this scenario to unfold, and Norway was ready to step up to the plate, as the country's then Minister of Defense, Odd Roger Enoksen, put it. At first, stepping up to the plate only referred to sending non-lethal military equipment on February 27th. According to Enoksen, this was the equipment Ukraine requested, and Norway was able to donate quickly. Some of the items included in the donation were as follows: 5,000 helmets, 1,500 bulletproof vests, 1,000 gas masks, 2,000 sleeping bags, and 10,000 sleeping pads. The Norwegian government also increased the humanitarian aid for Ukraine to a staggering $170 million, aimed at helping the most vulnerable groups in Ukraine, including children. However, a mere day later, Norway decided that non-lethal military equipment and humanitarian aid simply weren't enough. Arms support was imperative. So the Norwegian government decided to donate up to 2,000 M72 anti-tank weapons. Beloved among military forces for their portability and effectiveness, these weapons would provide Ukraine with crucial firepower against the advancing Russian armored vehicles. This decision also went against Norway's restrictive policy on exporting defense-related products, demonstrating just how far the nation was willing to go in support of Ukraine. In Store's words, Ukraine is now in a desperate and extraordinary situation, which is why Norway also allowed other countries to provide Norwegian-produced ammunition or weapons to Ukraine. In mid-March, Norway decided to go after Russia directly. The Norwegian government incorporated a wide-ranging package of sanctions against Russia in response to its illegal attack on Ukraine. The package, which Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, Anniken Huitfeldt, described as an expression of Norway's solidarity with the Ukrainian people, was also the biggest ever to be imposed by Norway against any country. The goal of these sanctions was to undermine Russia's capacity to fund its unlawful conflict with Ukraine. So Norway went all out. The country prevented the export of technology, goods, and services that could be used by Russia to bolster its military operations. The sanctions also targeted individuals in Russia and Belarus with ties to the Kremlin's war machine and the decision-making process for Ukraine, freezing their assets and barring their travel to Norway. Of course, there were also restrictions on Russian financial institutions, cutting them off from Norwegian markets. And even this was just the beginning. As Huitfeldt puts it, there will be more sanctions against Russia and Belarus to come, and they did come less than a week later. The new sanctions included the prohibiting of transactions with 12 Russian state-owned enterprises, imposing trade restrictions on iron and steel products, prohibiting exports of a range of luxury goods, banning new investments in the Russian energy sector, and expanding the list of sanctioned individuals to 877 and businesses to 62. However, the exact content of the new sanctions package wasn't the most important part. What was more crucial was Norway's willingness to continue exerting pressure on Russia and Putin by taking decisive and escalating actions. It's precisely this approach that will allow Norway to deal Russia a crushing blow further down the road. But for now, we're still firmly planted in the more moderate actions that marked the early stages of Norway's strategic intervention in the war in Ukraine. On March 30th, the Norwegian government decided to allocate another $18.6 million to Ukraine, this time aiming to support the country's government administration. This money was to be used to pay salaries for Ukrainian healthcare personnel, teachers, and public sector employees, and take care of pensions and social benefits. After all, how can Ukraine maintain its resilience and functionality amidst a war if its essential services and government functions are crippled? Throughout April and May of 2022, Norway's efforts to help Ukraine resist Russia were mostly focused on financial aid. Norway even donated around $9 million to Moldova, as this rather poor European country had no choice but to receive over 400,000 refugees from Ukraine. The message to Russia was clear: Norway was resolute and unyielding in its stand against tyranny. This stance also included taking care of wounded Ukrainian soldiers in Norway, a decision made by the government on June 1st. Around 550 soldiers were to be brought to Bergen Hospital Trust, Oslo University Hospital Trust, and Sunnaas Rehabilitation Hospital, facilities with unique expertise in the treatment of burns, trauma, and rehabilitation, praised by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. From June to September 2022, Norway kept piling sanctions against Russia and accumulating aid for Ukraine. On July 1st, it was decided the financial support for Ukraine would be raised to almost $1 billion over the next 2 years, with Sture once again reiterating that Norway would stand together with the Ukrainian people. On August 26th, the Norwegian government introduced new sanctions against Putin and his regime, further expanding and clarifying a series of measures. 3 days later, on August 29th, Norway pledged another $187 million to help procure natural gas for Ukraine in response to the energy crisis exacerbated by Russia's senseless war. However, throughout these months, Norway has also been sending military aid to Ukraine. Some of the most notable equipment sent to the country after the 2000 M72 anti-tank weapons in February include the following: 100 Mistral air defense systems. These man-portable infrared-guided missile systems are designed for short-range air defense, focusing on targeting and destroying low-flying aircraft, including helicopters and drones. The inclusion of these systems in Ukraine's arsenal has provided a critical boost to its air defense capabilities, enabling it to better protect its airspace and counter aerial threats. 22 155mm M109A3GN howitzers with ammunition in May. The M109A3GN is a variant of the M109 self-propelled howitzer, originally acquired by Norway between 1969 and 1971 from West Germany. These units were subsequently upgraded to the M109A3GN configuration during the late 1980s. The upgrade enhanced their capabilities with improved firepower, accuracy, and reliability, reflecting Norway's commitment to maintaining a modern and effective artillery force. 850 Black Hornet nano-micro military UAVs in August. These tiny, highly portable drones are equipped with cameras and are used for reconnaissance and surveillance. Their small size and advanced technology allow them to provide real-time intelligence and enhanced situational awareness on the battlefield, giving Ukrainian forces a significant edge in monitoring enemy movements and gathering crucial information. 14 Iveco light multi-role vehicles in October. This tactical vehicle is designed for various roles, including troop transport, reconnaissance, and logistics support. Its versatility and off-road capability make it an essential asset for mobility and operational flexibility on the battlefield. 2 firing units for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, or NASAMS for short, in November. This distributed short to medium-range ground-based air defense system was jointly developed by the Norwegian defense supplier Kongsberg Defence & Aerospace and the US defense contractor Raytheon. NASAMS is used to defend against unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, cruise missiles, fixed-wing aircraft, and helicopters firing a wide range of missiles. Military equipment and weapons deliveries continued throughout 2023, as well as Norwegian efforts across all other crucial fronts. In the equipment department, Ukraine received the following notable additions: 8 Leopard 2A4 main battle tanks in March. The Leopard 2A4, originally developed by Germany, is renowned for its robust armor, advanced fire control systems, and powerful 120mm smoothbore gun. These tanks are equipped with state-of-the-art targeting systems, making them highly effective against enemy forces and enhancing Ukraine's ability to conduct armored warfare. 2 Bergepanzer II armored recovery vehicles and 3 NM189 Ingenieur Panzerwagen armored engineering vehicles in March 2023. The Bergepanzer II is a crucial asset for battlefield recovery operations, allowing for the efficient recovery and repair of damaged and disabled vehicles under fire. As for the NM189 Ingenieur Panzerwagen, it provides essential support in mine clearing, fortification construction, and other engineering tasks. Together, these 2 vehicles significantly bolster Ukraine's logistical and operational capabilities, ensuring that essential repair and engineering functions can be performed safely and effectively in combat zones. IRIS-T anti-aircraft missiles in August. The IRIS air defense system, initially donated by Germany, was nothing short of a game-changer for Ukraine, which had been in desperate need of effective air defense capabilities since the beginning of the war. By supplying these advanced missiles, Norway significantly bolstered Ukraine's ability to intercept and neutralize incoming aerial threats. And given how fond the Russians have become of the so-called kamikaze drones, Norway's contribution provided a crucial shield against the barrage of aggression. 3 Arthur counter-battery radars in August. These sophisticated radars are designed to detect and track incoming artillery fire and provide crucial intelligence for counter-battery operations. Their deployment has enabled Ukraine to more effectively pinpoint enemy artillery positions and respond with precision, further strengthening its defensive capabilities and disrupting the enemy's firepower. 160 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles in August. Developed for anti-armor use and precision drone strikes, these missiles have allowed Ukraine to target and destroy high-value enemy assets, such as fortified positions, armored vehicles, and command centers, amplifying Ukraine's offensive capabilities and contributing to the ongoing resistance against Russian aggression. But then 2024 came, and the Russian aggression was heightened. With the $61 billion aid package from the US, Ukraine's #1 donor, stuck in limbo, Ukraine's remaining allies faced a critical juncture. Wait for the US and risk the erosion of gains made thus far, or act decisively to fill the void and sustain the fight against the relentless onslaught. Unsurprisingly, Norway chose the latter. On January 12th, it was reported that the Norwegian government made the decision to boost its national arms production by infusing $190 million into the country's defense industry. As you can probably guess, this decision primarily had to do with the war in Ukraine and the urgent need to demonstrate that Norway could continue providing substantial support amidst the escalating conflict. Prime Minister Stur's exact words were, "The war in Ukraine has created a situation where there is need for large quantities of ammunition. The government is therefore contributing with powerful measures so that the Norwegian defense industry can produce more." Of course, Norway wasn't looking out solely for Ukraine with this move. After all, the country's involvement and support for Ukraine has already left a bitter taste in Putin's mouth, a man known for his insatiable appetite for control and retaliation. So, by bolstering its arms production, Norway is also fortifying its own defenses and signaling a steadfast commitment to resisting Russian aggression. According to Prime Minister Stur, half of this investment will focus on projects at Nammo, a Norwegian aerospace and defense company specializing in ammunition. Since the invasion started, Nammo has been struggling to keep up, forcing the company to ask for government support in the fall of 2022. With the infusion of funds, Nammo can ramp up production, ensuring a steady supply of critical ammunition both for Ukraine's defense and Norway's own security needs. As for the other half of the investment, it'll be allocated to various projects in Norway's defense industry, which are undisclosed for now. The lack of ammunition in Ukraine and beyond became very much apparent by March of 2024. According to the European Union, Ukraine only received 52% of the intended ammunition, primarily due to the lack of US support. As a result, Russia was outshelling Ukraine 5-1, pushing the country's forces back on the battlefield. So the Czech Republic sprang into action. The country's president, Petr Pavel, launched an initiative to gather the necessary ammunition for Ukraine by encouraging Western countries to buy the available stockpiles from countries in Africa and Asia. These countries might not be willing to send the ammo to Ukraine directly, but they're surely willing to sell it for a profit. Unsurprisingly, Norway joined the Czech initiative, allocating $153 million for hundreds of thousands of desperately needed artillery shells for Ukraine. As a result, and with the help of other European allies, the Czech Republic managed to gather 300,000 of the available 800,000 high-caliber shells relatively quickly. By now it's obvious why Norway became such a huge problem for Putin. The country has actively sought to identify all the possible avenues to undermine Russia's military efforts, systematically closing the gaps that could have allowed Putin to gain the upper hand. So when reports emerged that Ukraine was struggling to juggle and maintain all the different Western-made tanks it had received, it shouldn't be surprising that Norway was the one to offer a solution. In April, the Norwegian Ministry of Defense pledged up to $13.7 million for the support, repair, and maintenance of the Leopard 2A4 tanks in Poland, the very tanks it had also previously sent to Ukraine. Speaking of critical military aid, Norway continued providing just that, even after the long-awaited US aid package was finally approved by Congress. In May, the country announced a new joint package of military assistance worth around $190 million. The package in question primarily focused on the most urgently needed military capabilities, such as air defense, anti-drone systems, radar equipment, and naval capabilities. Once again, the package came with a few reassuring words from Norway's current Minister of Defense, Bjorn Arild Gram, who stated, "We stand with and support Ukraine as long as necessary." Thanks to Norway's unyielding support and commendable bravery given its proximity to Russia, the country was also able to deal Putin a devastating blow, one that has the potential to reshape the dynamics of the conflict. On May 30th, it was reported that Norway officially gave Ukraine the green light to use its weapons against Russian targets on Russian soil. If you're unsure why this is such a big deal, all you need to know is that Ukraine was previously only able to use Western-made weapons inside its territory, including the occupied regions. This severely limited the country's ability to strike at the heart of Russia's military operations and infrastructure, effectively keeping the fight contained within its borders. With Norway's approval, however, Ukraine can now take the fight directly to Russia, extending its reach beyond the front lines and disrupting critical military operations deep within Russian territory. Although Western countries were previously hesitant to allow Ukraine to do so out of fear, it became obvious that this was the only way to truly defeat Russia. Plus, Ukraine is absolutely within its rights to defend itself by any means necessary, especially against an aggressor that has shown no regard for international law or human life. The current Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Espen Barth Eide, put it this way: "We also believe that Ukraine has an absolutely clear international right to attack Russia on its territory as part of its defense of its own territory." He further clarified that such actions are absolutely normal in war, and the world can't expect Ukraine to fight with one hand behind its back. Eide didn't go into any further details in order to avoid revealing any strategically important information to the Russians. His exact words were, "When it concerns specific conditions and the conditions for specific weapon systems, we, like other countries, will be careful not to speak loudly about it. It's war, and there are many people who follow what we say publicly." Now, speaking of these other countries, the truth is that Norway wasn't the only one to give Ukraine this game-changing permission. So what makes Norway's decision so consequential? Well, Norway is one of the few Ukrainian allies who've pledged to deliver F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jets to Ukraine. And if you know anything about Ukraine, you know that Zelensky has been practically begging for these jets ever since the invasion started. With these supersonic multi-role fighter aircraft, Ukraine would finally be able to stand up to Russia in the skies and challenge its undisputed air dominance, which has cost the country greatly in these 2.5 years. Norway is expected to donate 6 F-16s by the end of 2024, after previously pledging to do so in 2023 on Ukraine's Independence Day, August 24th. As the 2024 Independence Day approaches, Ukraine has only received a few of the promised 60 F-16s from Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands, but it's displayed them proudly nonetheless, sending a strong message of resilience and international support. Although Norway has yet to deliver its portion of the pledged F-16s, the country hasn't been sitting idly by. Since the fall of 2023, it's taken part in training the Ukrainian fighter pilots who are going to fly these jets once they arrive and become operational. And when this happens, Ukraine will fully be able to fly the F-16s into Russian territory, all thanks to Norway's invaluable permission. This makes the F-16s a crucial part of the offensive Western-made arsenal that Ukraine will now be able to take advantage of. For now, most NATO countries are hesitant about green-lighting the use of long-range weapons, for fear of dragging the rest of Europe into the war. Other than that, all the weapons donated from countries like the Baltic states, Canada, the Czech Republic, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, Sweden, the UK, and the US are now fair game for military purposes in Russian territory. However, even after successfully dealing Russia a massive blow, Norway hasn't stopped its relentless efforts to stop Putin and help Ukraine. In June of 2024, it once again focused on the issue of electricity in Ukraine, as the Russian summer offensive wreaked havoc on the country's already strained energy infrastructure. Since the Kharkiv Oblast was the main target of the summer offensive, Norway also focused a large chunk of its efforts on this region. The goal of this latest initiative is to help Ukraine repair the energy infrastructure in the region before the freezing winter hits. To achieve this goal, Norway has allocated a little over $100 million to the entire Ukraine, where over 50% of the power production capacity has been destroyed, with some $11 million reserved for Kharkiv Oblast. The money came with another harsh statement by the Norwegian Prime Minister, this time calling out Russia for carrying out massive, systematic attacks to paralyze the power grid. However, in the same breath, Støre also praised the Ukrainians for working day and night to maintain essential electricity supplies for the population. Norway has also made it abundantly clear that it sees a future for Ukraine beyond the current conflict. That's why it also pledged to contribute almost $3 million to strengthening the Ukrainian business sector. According to IDA, by supporting private sector development, we are also supporting Ukraine's economy and resilience. With this move, Norway has once again stood out among Ukrainian allies, as many of them find it too risky to invest in Ukraine. But Norway has no doubt about it, Ukraine will prevail in the end, and it's investing in that certainty. However, to help Ukraine achieve a victory, Norway also continued sending military aid, this time focusing solely on the much-needed air defenses. On July 11th, the Norwegian government announced plans to donate $93 million to Ukraine to help the country protect its population from Russian bombs and missiles. The announcement came at the 2024 Washington summit commemorating the 75th anniversary of NATO. Støre also confirmed that Norway was planning to join Germany in sending a complete IRIS-T air defense battery to Ukraine. Together with the US-made Patriot system, the IRIS air defense system has been a cornerstone of Ukraine's efforts to create a robust shield against Russia's relentless aerial assaults. With all the millions of dollars we've mentioned so far, it's clear that Norway is sparing no expense when it comes to helping Ukraine and stopping Putin. Here's a quick breakdown of the total amount of aid Norway has sent to Ukraine since the invasion started, according to the Ukrainian support tracker by the German think tank the Kiel Institute. Between February 24, 2022 and June 30, 2024, Norway has donated $1.31 billion in military aid, $850 million in financial aid, $507 million in humanitarian aid. These figures mean that Norway has allocated 0.5% of its GDP to support Ukraine. Perhaps even more impressively, it managed to do so without any European Union share. For comparison's sake, Germany has donated a little more to Ukraine in terms of total GDP percentage. However, a third of its contributions have come from EU funds, highlighting Norway's unique role in providing direct and substantial support without relying on broader European resources. As things currently stand, this support won't stop anytime soon, and we aren't just saying this based on Norway's impressive track record. In fact, Norway and Ukraine actually signed an agreement on security cooperation and long-term support, ensuring Norway will continue to help Ukraine and irritate Putin until at least 2027. But what does this agreement entail? For the most part, everything we've covered in this video, just more of it. Essentially, this agreement represents a comprehensive partnership between Norway and Ukraine, which covers the following key aspects. Number 1, strong condemnation of the Russian aggression. Sure, condemnation alone will get you nowhere, but it's important for the world to continuously denounce Russia's illegal and brutal war against Ukraine, which violates international law. It's also essential for all countries, including Norway, to affirm their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and democratic values, and this is precisely what Putin wants to obliterate. Number 2, support for Ukraine's defense and reform. Norway has been providing for it for over 2 years, and it doesn't plan to stop. Donating military, financial, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine is among the country's top priorities, as the agreement made abundantly clear. In terms of concrete figures, Norway plans to spend around $7 billion by 2027, helping Ukraine fight the good fight. Of course, this fight includes more main battle tanks, artillery, air defense systems, and training for Ukrainian forces, which is precisely what is promised under the Agreement on Security Cooperation and Long-Term Support. Norway will also aid in integrating Ukrainian defense systems with NATO standards and support Ukraine's defense industry and cybersecurity. As for civilian and humanitarian support, the agreement allocates substantial aid for maintaining government functions, nuclear safety, infrastructure repair, energy security, and humanitarian demining. Norway will also support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction efforts, including medical evacuations and countering disinformation. Number 3. Political and legal accountability. Even when the war ends, Norway doesn't plan on letting Russia off the hook. Together with Ukraine, the country is committed to achieving a just and sustainable peace and holding Russia accountable for damages and war crimes. These efforts include pursuing reparations and supporting international criminal investigations. Given how volatile the war in Ukraine is, the Agreement on Security Cooperation and Long-Term Support prioritizes one thing above all else: flexibility. Norway's support is designed to be flexible and adapt to Ukraine's evolving needs, ensuring effective assistance no matter what Putin throws at the country. Speaking of Putin, how do you think he perceives Norway's unrelenting help for Ukraine? Is he too busy to bother with this Scandinavian nation, or is he already drawing up his revenge plans? Remember, many experts believe that Putin isn't planning on stopping with just Ukraine.